War on the Eastern Front was like nothing the world had ever seen, a place where entire armies vanished, where men froze in their trenches, starved in ruined cities, and faced horrors that defy imagination. In this series, we don't talk about generals or maps. We hear the voices of the soldiers themselves, German soldiers who lived through the fire and the ice. Their stories are raw, unfiltered, and brutal. What you are about to hear are their confessions from the Eastern Front. Friedrich Albrecht was 24 years old, a corporal in the 6th Company, 1st Battalion of the SS Division Totenkopf. In February 1942, he was among the 100,000 men encircled in what became known as the Demyansk Pocket. Cut off by Soviet offensives, supplied only by sporadic Luftwaffe drops, the division endured months of starvation, frostbite, and ceaseless attacks. Albrecht's testimony, recorded years later in a military hospital, captures the desperation of those trapped in the frozen swamps of northern Russia. I stopped believing in warmth at Demyansk. There was no warmth, only a cold that gnawed at your bones and made you forget you'd ever been alive before. The snow never stopped falling, and when it did, the fog took over. We lived like animals, burrowed into the earth, surrounded by corpses frozen in strange poses, eyes open as if still begging for food. We had no food. The Luftwaffe promised supplies, but the drops fell miles away, often into Soviet hands. Sometimes the canisters broke open when they hit the ground, scattering crumbs into the snow. We fought each other for them, grown men, soldiers in uniform, crawling on all fours to lick frozen bread out of the dirt. I remember one day finding a tin of horse meat. It was frozen solid. I smashed it with my rifle butt and ate it raw, swallowing chunks of ice and fat until my stomach turned inside out. I vomited, then kept eating. We boiled belts, leather, anything that could soften in water. One of my comrades swore you could get nutrients from boiled paper. He tore pages out of a Soviet propaganda leaflet, shredded them into a pot, and we drank the bitter sludge. He died the next morning, maybe from the paper, maybe from everything else. The cold took more than hunger did. Frostbite spread like a plague. Fingers turned black and brittle, noses rotted, feet swelled until the skin split open. We cut boots off the dead and wore them without caring if they were frozen with blood or filled with half-rotten toes. My own feet went numb in March. I woke one night and found 2 of my toes gone, broken off in the wool. I felt nothing. I just stared and laughed like a madman. The Soviets shelled us daily. You couldn't tell if it was day or night. The sky was always grey, smoke hanging low, trenches caved in, burying men alive. We dug with bare hands to free them, only to find them already suffocated, eyes bulging, mouths stuffed with dirt. We stopped digging after a while. Too much effort for nothing. The worst were the nights. You'd lie there listening to the wind and the moaning of the wounded. Some cried out for their mothers, others for God. One night, a comrade named Weber kept screaming that worms were crawling under his skin. He clawed at himself until strips of flesh hung loose. He bled to death before dawn. We covered him with snow and sat in silence, afraid that the same madness would take us. We slept beside corpses, not out of disrespect, but because their bodies blocked the wind. Once I used a frozen officer as a backrest. His face was shattered, his jaw gone. I leaned on him while cleaning my rifle and thought nothing of it. Death was no longer shocking. It was simply furniture. Some men carried grenades with the pin half pulled, swearing they wouldn't be taken alive. One night, I heard a muffled boom in the next dugout. When I looked, all that remained were legs sticking out of the snow. No one spoke. We just turned away and tried to sleep. I thought about home often, about my mother's bread, my sister's laughter. Then the artillery started again, and I forgot everything. The earth shook, snow sprayed into the trench, and I pressed my face against the mud, praying the shell would take me quickly. It never did. The Soviets crept close in the fog. Sometimes they attacked with bayonets, screaming like demons. We fought them hand to hand, stabbing, biting, clawing, drowning each other in the muck. Once I strangled a boy with my bare hands, his eyes wide and wet. He couldn't have been older than 16. When it was over, I sat there shaking, his face still pressed into the mud, my fingers locked around his throat. I couldn't let go. When relief finally came in April, I was no longer myself. I had lost 2 toes, 3 fingers, and whatever soul I once had. They called us survivors of Demyansk. I don't feel like I survived. Part of me is still there, frozen in those swamps, buried under snow, screaming into the fog. Hans Keller was 27 years old, a grenadier in the 16th Panzer Grenadier Division. His unit was thrown into the fighting around the Rojhev salient, a stretch of front the soldiers called the meat grinder. For more than a year, German divisions bled in the forests and swamps west of Moscow, enduring ceaseless Soviet offensives, mud, frostbite, and unimaginable losses. What Keller left behind in fragments of letters and an interview after the war paints one of the darkest pictures of the Eastern Front. They called it Rjev. We called it the place where men went to vanish. The ground was swamp, frozen hard in winter, sucking you down in spring. Our trenches filled with brown water up to the knees. We lived in that water. We slept in it, ate in it, pissed in it. When frost came, the mud froze into knives. You couldn't move without cutting your hands. Every step you heard the squelch of filth, sometimes bones breaking under the mud. You didn't know if it was wood, ice, or a comrade buried shallow. Food? If you were lucky, frozen bread and cabbage soup so thin you could see the bottom of the pot. The rest of the time, nothing. We boiled horse meat when a supply animal collapsed. We stripped it down to the bones within minutes. I remember biting into half-frozen meat while shells fell all around us, my teeth shattered, but I kept chewing. Hunger doesn't care about pain. The Soviets attacked every day, sometimes with artillery for hours, barrages so thick the earth shook like jelly. You'd press your face into the mud and feel the ground rippling under you. When the shelling ended, they came in waves, screaming, rifles, bayonets, machine guns. We cut them down with MG fire, watched them collapse into heaps. Then more came, always more. They stepped on their own dead to reach us. Sometimes they crawled over piles of corpses higher than the trench walls. We killed them, we killed and killed until the barrels of our MGs glowed red, until our hands blistered from reloading. But no matter how many fell, more came. I don't know how many I shot. I stopped counting after the first 100. Numbers didn't matter. Only survival. The trenches reeked of rot. Corpses lay between us and them, swelling in the thaw, crawling with maggots. We used them as sandbags, stacked them to reinforce the walls. I remember leaning against a dead Russian like he was a comrade, his frozen shoulder pressed to mine while I smoked. That was normal. That was life. Frostbite was the silent killer. Men's fingers blackened, toes snapped off in boots. One night, I pulled my boots off and found 2 of my toes stuck inside the wool. I stared at them like they belonged to someone else. I didn't feel a thing. I laughed, then cried. My hands shook so badly I couldn't reload my rifle. A comrade wrapped my feet in rags. He died 2 days later, shrapnel to the neck. I took his boots. The cold gnawed at us, but the mud was worse. Spring came and swallowed everything. Guns sank, horses drowned, trucks tilted and vanished into bogs. We waded waist-deep through brown slime, rifles above our heads, men screaming as they slipped under. You couldn't save them. The mud took them whole. One moment they were beside you, the next gone, bubbles rising. Sleep was a curse. You closed your eyes, and the screams came back. The shells, the bayonets, the faces, men clawing at you, begging for water, for a bullet. I woke with my hands around my own throat, strangling myself. Others screamed in their sleep. Others didn't wake at all. They froze where they lay. We stacked the bodies at the trench edge to block the wind. Lice infested us. They crawled in the seams of our coats, laid eggs in the folds of our skin. We scratched until we bled. One man tore half his scalp open, clawing at them. He laughed as he did it, laughed until he bled out. Sometimes the Soviets attacked at night. Flare guns turned the sky into a false daylight, green and red shadows dancing on corpses. We fought like animals in the dark, knives and entrenching tools, swinging blindly, striking flesh. Once I drove my spade into a man's skull and felt it crack like an egg. I vomited right there, then kept fighting. The worst was the silence. Days without shelling. When fog rolled over the swamps and you heard nothing but your own breathing. That silence was heavier than artillery. You knew they were out there, watching, crawling closer. Every bush was a sniper. Every shadow was death. Once, a comrade named Dietrich snapped. He stood up in the trench and started screaming for the Soviets to come get him. He waved his arms like a madman. A bullet took him through the mouth. He fell backwards into the mud, gurgling blood. None of us moved. We just watched him die. I envied him. I remember a Soviet prisoner once, a boy, maybe 17. He was shaking, frostbitten, half-starved. Our officer asked him questions. He didn't answer. The officer shot him in the head, just like that. I stared at the body and thought, that could be me tomorrow. That could be any of us. The wounded piled up in the dugouts, no morphine, no bandages. We tore cloth from the dead to wrap stumps. Some men begged us to finish them. Others crawled away into the forest to die alone. One shot himself with his last bullet. Another pulled the pin on a grenade under his blanket. The blast smeared half the dugout with blood. We said nothing. We just shoveled dirt over it and went back to waiting. In March 43, the Soviets hit us with everything. Artillery, rockets, tanks. The ground shook like the end of the world. We fired until our rifles jammed, until our machine guns melted. Then they came, swarms of them, endless. We fought until our trench was a pit of bodies, ours and theirs mixed, blood soaking into the mud. I don't remember how I survived. I only remember the stench, the screams, the mud choking my boots. When we were finally pulled back from Rzhev, they called us veterans, survivors of the meat grinder. But we were ghosts, hollow eyes, trembling hands, blank stares. I left more of myself in that swamp than I ever brought back. At night I still smell it, blood, shit, rot, cordite. I hear the mud sucking men down, the screams under the earth. Rzhev wasn't a battle. It was a pit that swallowed men and spat out nothing but bones. Erich Bauer was 22 years old, a private in the 544th Infantry Regiment of the 389th Infantry Division. His division was sent into the cauldron of Stalingrad, fighting in the southern districts near the Red October factory. By January 1943, what was left of his regiment was encircled with the rest of the 6th Army. Bauer was captured after weeks spent in the ruins, starving, wounded, and barely alive. His words are fragments pieced together from interrogation transcripts and letters he never sent. I thought I knew what hunger was before Stalingrad. I didn't. Hunger in Stalingrad was not emptiness. It was pain, gnawing, twisting pain that never left you. It lived in your belly like an animal. It chewed at your ribs, made your hands shake, made you see food that wasn't there. I dreamed of bread, thick slices of warm bread with butter. I woke with my mouth full of dust. We had no food. At first the Luftwaffe dropped canisters, but the Soviets shot them down, or the wind carried them into their lines. When one fell in our sector, men fought like dogs over crumbs. I saw soldiers stab each other for a frozen potato. One day we found a horse carcass. We stripped it clean in minutes. We ate the meat raw, gnawing at frozen tendons like wolves. Then there were no more horses. We boiled leather, belts, harnesses, boot soles. We scraped them clean, cut them into strips, and boiled them in rusty helmets with snow. It smelled like glue. It stuck to your teeth. Some chewed wood, paper, even sawdust. I chewed a strip of bark until my gums bled. There were rats, fat rats, bigger than cats, feeding on the dead. We set traps, broke their necks, roasted them over candle stubs. They squealed like children. I ate them anyway. Their grease stuck to my lips. One night, a rat ran across my chest while I slept. I woke and bit it with my teeth. I don't know why. Hunger made us mad. The cold was worse than the hunger. We had no winter coats, only thin uniforms stiff with frozen sweat. Temperatures dropped below -30. We huddled in cellars among rubble, burning books, chairs, floorboards, anything to make a flame. Sometimes we burned photographs, letters from home. We cried while they turned to ash. Frostbite ate us alive. Fingers blackened, ears fell off. A comrade showed me his hand one morning. 3 fingers had snapped off in his glove. He laughed, then wept. Another man pissed on his own boots to thaw them. The steam rose from the leather, stinking. He smiled. 2 days later, both his feet were gone. The city stank of death. Corpses lay everywhere, in stairwells, alleys, collapsed factories, some frozen stiff, some bloated with gas, civilians, soldiers, children, horses, all mixed. The snow was black with ash and blood. We used bodies as walls, stacked them to block bullets and wind. I remember hiding behind a pile of corpses while Soviets fired down the street. The bullets thudded into them. They shielded me better than sandbags. I didn't feel horror. I felt nothing. The Soviets came at us day and night. Snipers picked us off through cracks in the walls. You didn't light a candle, didn't smoke a cigarette, didn't even look through a window. One spark, one glint of glass, and your head was gone. I watched a friend light a match. The bullet hit him before the flame reached the wick. The fighting was madness, hand to hand in cellars, in stairwells, in corridors filled with smoke and dust. We fought with knives, bayonets, shovels. I split a man's skull with my entrenching tool. His blood sprayed my face, hot in the cold air. I wiped it off with my sleeve and kept swinging. Grenades rolled down staircases, bounced off rubble. We threw them back when we could. Once, one went off in a corridor full of wounded. The blast painted the walls red. I walked through the smoke and slipped on blood. I fell into what was left of a man. His intestines wrapped around my boot. I screamed, tore them off, then started laughing. I laughed until I vomited. The screams never stopped. Wounded men cried for water, for their mothers, for mercy. One begged me to shoot him. I did. I put the barrel to his chest and pulled the trigger. He sighed like he was falling asleep. I envied him. Civilians still lived there, ghosts in rags. They wandered the ruins, eyes blank, skin yellow from hunger. Some begged us for food. We had none. A woman brought us her dead baby, frozen stiff, begging us to bury it. We couldn't. The ground was iron. She left the bundle in the snow and walked away. I still see that tiny face, blue and stiff, eyes frozen open. By January, we knew it was over. The Soviets closed the ring. The Luftwaffe failed us. Ammunition was gone. Men carried rifles with no bullets, knives with no handles, grenades with no pins. We waited for death. Some prayed, some cursed, some stared at nothing. I lost count of the days. Time meant nothing. Only the cold, the hunger, the waiting. We sat in basements, bones poking through our skin, eyes hollow. We looked like the dead already. One night, the Soviets broke through. They stormed our building. Grenades, rifles, flamethrowers. Fire roared through the cellar. Men burned alive, their screams like pigs in slaughter. I crawled through smoke, choking, blinded. I crawled over corpses, over flames, until I saw them. Soviet soldiers, faces black with soot, eyes hard. I dropped my rifle and raised my hands. I didn't feel fear. I felt relief. Relief that it was over. Relief that I didn't have to fight anymore, that I didn't have to eat rats, burn letters, bury comrades. They stripped me of my helmet, pulled me into the street. Snow fell on my burned skin. I wept. I survived Stalingrad. I don't know why. Maybe that was the worst fate of all. Karl Hoffmann was 29 years old, a private in the 213th Infantry Regiment of the 24th Infantry Division. In June 1942, he was thrown into the final assault on Sevastopol, the Soviet Black Sea fortress. The operation was one of the most ferocious sieges of the war, supported by the heaviest guns Germany ever built. Hoffmann survived the storming of the positions at Sapun Ridge, but was evacuated days later with chest wounds and shrapnel fever. He died 4 weeks afterward in a field hospital near Simferopol. His account was taken down by a nurse who wrote down his words before he succumbed to infection. They said Sevastopol was a fortress. That word is too small. It was a world of stone and fire, dug into cliffs, bunkers, tunnels, and gun batteries as wide as cathedrals. We were told to storm it with rifles, grenades, and courage. I didn't believe we could. The bombardment started first, the heaviest guns I had ever seen, the 600mm mortars, the 800mm Dora. When they fired, the air itself cracked. We watched shells the size of wagons arc through the sky and vanish into the hills. Seconds later, the earth split. Fountains of rock and fire hurled into the clouds. We thought nothing could survive it, but when we advanced, they were still there. The Soviets crawled out of their bunkers like ants from a burning nest, firing machine guns, mortars, flamethrowers. The ground was already covered with bodies before we reached the wire. We carried explosives on our backs, satchel charges to blow the bunkers. I ran with one through a storm of bullets, slid into a trench, lit the fuse, and shoved it into a firing slit. The blast shook my teeth loose. The screams inside still ring in my ears. We stormed through smoke, firing into dugouts, stabbing with bayonets in tunnels lit by fire. There was no sky, no earth, just darkness and screams. The smell was gunpowder and burning flesh. One comrade, Müller, was hit by a flamethrower. He ran 3 steps before collapsing, burning like a torch, his screams high and thin. No one could help him. He curled up into ash. I stepped over what was left and kept going. The Soviets fought like demons. In one bunker, we found men half-blinded from smoke still firing until we tore the rifles from their hands. They wouldn't surrender. Even unarmed, they clawed at us with knives and fists. I stabbed one in the throat. He spat blood in my face and fell. I still taste the iron. By the 3rd day, we were animals, covered in dust, blood and filth, voices gone from screaming. The wounded begged for water, but there was none. I gave one comrade my last sip from a canteen. He died anyway. His hand stayed clenched on my sleeve until I pried it free. On Sapun Ridge, the artillery never stopped. We stormed uphill through trenches filled with corpses, Soviets and Germans mixed. Every step slid on blood and stone. A shell burst beside me, throwing me into a crater. I woke hours later buried in dirt, my chest torn by shrapnel. I crawled out, coughing blood, ears ringing, and stumbled after the others. The ridge was ours, but it looked like the moon, a landscape of blackened stone and burning timber. Victory, it looked like the end of the world. They pulled me back to a dressing station. The doctor said the metal in my chest was too deep. They bandaged me and sent me rearward, promising I'd be all right. But fever came. My wound festered. The flies were everywhere, crawling into the bandages, laying eggs. I begged them to cut it out. They said I was too weak for surgery. I lay in a hospital tent with the groans of others, staring at the canvas above me. I wrote to my wife, told her I was alive, told her we had won. I didn't tell her the truth, that I knew I wouldn't see her again, that the stink of rot was already inside me, that the fortress had swallowed more than my blood. One night I felt the fever break, sweat soaking the sheets. I thought I was saved, but the next morning I couldn't breathe, my chest filled with fluid. The nurse leaned close, asked me to speak. I told her I was cold, that Sevastopol was still burning in my eyes. Then darkness came. I died 4 weeks after Sapun Ridge. They buried me in Crimea, far from home. My division marched on without me. All that remained of me were the words I left with the nurse, written in her careful hand. A voice from Sevastopol, where stone and fire devoured us all. Otto Reinhardt was 25 years old, a loader in the Grossdeutschland Division's Panzer Regiment. In July 1943, he took part in Operation Citadel, the German summer offensive aimed at crushing the Soviet salient around Kursk. His regiment was part of the Southern Pincer, advancing toward Prokhorovka in one of the largest tank battles in history. Otto's testimony survives only in fragments, written in a diary found burned beside his destroyed tank. What follows is a reconstruction of his words, the voice of a young man who fought and died in the furnace of Kursk. When we moved toward Kursk, they told us this was the decisive blow, that this battle would turn the war back in our favor. The divisions were gathered like an iron fist, tigers, panthers, panzers, all gleaming in the July sun. We believed it. We believed the Russians would break like they always had, that they couldn't stand against our steel. The first days felt like triumph. The artillery opened with a roar that shook the earth. Shells thundered into the horizon. Fields erupted. The sky filled with smoke and dust. Then our tanks rolled forward, a wall of armor stretching as far as you could see. Engines growled, treads clanked, dust rose in clouds. We felt invincible. But the Russians were ready. They had dug into the earth like moles, trench after trench, line after line, minefields, wire, anti-tank guns hidden in hedgerows and copses. The first mine we hit tore a panzer apart, turret blown sky-high, black smoke trailing into the sky. We drove past, staring at the burning wreck, trying not to imagine the men inside. The battlefield was endless smoke and fire. Artillery never stopped. You couldn't tell where the horizon ended, just smoke, flashes, and wrecks. Every field was cratered, every bush could hide a gun. I watched a tiger take a hit straight through the side, the crew scrambling out, their clothes on fire. One tripped, screaming, rolling in the dirt. No one could help him. We drove past. Orders said never stop. Inside the tank it was hell, hotter than any summer I'd ever known. The engine burning behind us, the gun slamming in our ears. I loaded shells until my arms ached, hands blistered, sweat dripping into my eyes. Every time the main gun fired, the blast punched through my chest, rattling my teeth. The smell was cordite, grease, sweat, and fear, always fear. We couldn't see much. Periscopes filled with dust and smoke, silhouettes moving, sometimes ours, sometimes theirs. You fired at shadows, at flashes, at shapes that might be tanks. Sometimes they were tractors or burning hulks. Sometimes you didn't know until it was too late. The Soviets counterattacked with everything. T-34s swarmed like ants, pouring out of the haze, guns flashing, tracks grinding. They came in waves, not caring how many burned, not caring how many died. For every one we destroyed, two more seemed to appear. They drove straight into us, ramming, firing at point blank. I saw one ram a tiger, both tanks exploding together in a fireball. We fought for hours that felt like years. My commander screamed orders, the gunner cursed, the driver cried as he pushed us forward into the furnace. Shells rang against our armor, sparks showering inside, bolts rattling loose. Every hit was a hammer blow. Every miss felt like a miracle. Once, a shell punched through and tore our radio operator apart. He was there one moment, gone the next, just blood and rags on the wall. We stared in horror but kept fighting. We had to. We shoved his body into a corner and kept loading shells. The battlefield was a graveyard of steel. Burning tanks everywhere, German and Russian alike. Black smoke coiling into the sky. The ground shook under the weight of thousands of engines, thousands of guns. The noise was beyond sound. It was a living thing, a roar that swallowed thought, swallowed everything. We ran out of shells. I sat in the corner, shaking, holding a pistol, knowing it wouldn't matter when the Soviets came. Then an ammunition truck found us. We loaded again, hands trembling, and rolled forward into the slaughter. By the third day, we were wrecks. We hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. Our uniforms stank of sweat and cordite. Eyes bloodshot, hands blistered, ears ringing. We were machines more than men, loading, firing, killing. Then came Prokhorovka. The Soviets threw everything at us. Hundreds of tanks, a tide of steel, screaming through the fields, guns blazing, ramming, colliding. It wasn't war anymore. It was madness. Tank against tank, at ranges so close you could see the faces of the men inside before they burned. Our Panzer rocked with every shot. We fired until the barrel smoked, until our loaders' hands bled raw. T-34s came from every side. One hit us, ricocheted, another slammed into our track, immobilizing us. We were stuck. I remember the last moments, the gunner screaming, "They're behind us," the commander shouting into the radio, static and panic. Then the impact. A shell pierced us from the rear. Fire filled the cabin instantly. Heat, smoke, screams. My flesh seared, my lungs filled with smoke. I tried to open the hatch, but the handle was molten metal. My hands stuck, skin tearing. I fell back, burning alive, choking. The last thing I saw was the driver, face melting, clawing at the hatch. Then, blackness. They found my diary among the ashes weeks later. A few pages survived, charred at the edges. My words ended where my life did, in fire, steel, and screams on the fields of Kursk. Friedrich Albrecht was 21 years old, a rifleman in the 194th Infantry Regiment of the 71st Infantry Division. His unit entered the northern districts of Stalingrad in September 1942, in the early weeks of the battle, when the city was still largely intact, but already turning into rubble. The 71st was ordered to clear workers' housing and factories near the Tsaritsa Gorge. Friedrich never saw the encirclement. He was killed in October by a sniper while scavenging water from a cistern. His diary found on his body captured the chaos of those first weeks of urban combat. When we crossed into the city, I thought we were marching into hell. Smoke hung over every street, buildings burned like torches, windows glared like empty eyes. The noise never stopped, artillery thundering, planes diving, Rubble crashing down, screams echoing through alleys. Stalingrad wasn't a city anymore. It was a corpse, still twitching. We fought for every building, every floor, every room. A block of workers' flats became a battlefield for days. We stormed stairwells with grenades, bayonets, pistols. You never knew what waited around the corner. A Soviet with a submachine gun, a woman with a rifle, a boy with a grenade. Civilians hid in basements. Sometimes they fought us too. Sometimes they just watched, eyes hollow. I fired my rifle so many times I forgot the count. I remember the faces more than the shots. A Soviet soldier burst from a doorway, firing wild. I shot him in the chest. He staggered back against the wall, blood spreading. He looked at me with wide eyes, then slid down and sat like he was just resting. I still see his eyes. The factories were worse. Machines twisted into ruins, boilers leaking steam, floors slick with oil. The Soviets turned them into fortresses. They fired from behind lathes, from the rafters, from holes in the floor. You couldn't see them until the bullets hit. We threw grenades into shadows, fired into pipes, bayoneted through smoke. It wasn't war, it was murder in the dark. The smell was everywhere, cordite, smoke, and rot. Bodies lay in piles, German and Russian tangled. Rats ran over them, fat from the feast. Once, I kicked open a door and saw a room filled with corpses stacked to the ceiling. The Soviets had used it as a barricade. We had to climb over them to keep moving. Their faces stared up, frozen in death, mouths open, eyes glassy. I stepped on a hand that still felt warm. At night, the city glowed with fire. We slept in cellars, rats crawling over us, plaster dust falling from the ceiling. We ate stale bread and horse meat when we had it. Most of the time, nothing. Water was worse. The wells were poisoned or destroyed. We sucked ice from pipes, scooped water from puddles filled with ash. I risked my life once to reach a cistern. A sniper caught me in the shoulder. I dropped the bucket, blood pouring down my sleeve. They dragged me back, patched me with rags, and pushed me into the line again. No rest, no mercy. Snipers ruled the ruins. You never looked through a window, never stood in the open. They were everywhere, in chimneys, in sewers, in the shadows of collapsed walls. One shot a comrade of mine as he lit a cigarette. Another dropped our sergeant with a bullet through the eye. We fired back blindly, never sure if we hit. The Soviets were ghosts. We fought hand-to-hand more times than I can count. Once, in a basement, a Soviet lunged at me with a knife. We rolled in the dirt, biting, clawing, smashing each other's heads into the wall. I felt his breath on my face, smelled blood on his teeth. I smashed his skull with a brick. When he stopped moving, I sat shaking, covered in his blood and mine. My hands wouldn't let go of the brick. The worst was the screams. Wounded men calling for help, calling for water, calling for their mothers. One night we lay in a cellar while outside a German tank burned. The crew screamed inside for an hour before it went silent. None of us moved, we just listened, faces white in the flickering light. By October I had stopped writing. My words turned to fragments. No food, cold, rats, screams. That's all I had left. The last entry came 2 days before my death. We hold one block, Russians hold the next. Between us, only rubble and corpses. This is not a city. This is the graveyard of the world. A sniper killed me fetching water. They buried me in the ruins. My diary was sent back, a voice from Stalingrad that ended in silence. Heinrich Mertens was 27 years old, a corporal in the 18th Infantry Regiment of the 6th Infantry Division. His unit had marched nearly 1,000 kilometers across Russia, reaching the outskirts of Moscow in December 1941. There, like hundreds of thousands of others, he was trapped in the blizzards and frost of the Russian winter. His body was never recovered, but fragments of his letters and a comrade's testimony preserve his voice. When we crossed the Russian border in June, the sun was shining. We thought the campaign would be finished in weeks. We marched through fields of wheat, through villages that burned, through endless roads. People waved at us or stared at us with hatred. We laughed, sang songs, wrote letters home promising victory. By December, none of us sang anymore. The cold had killed every note. The frost began in early November. At first, it was just a sting in the fingers, a bite in the air. Then it became something else. A wall that pressed against your lungs, a knife that sliced your skin. The cold wasn't weather, it was an enemy, stronger than any Russian soldier. It seeped into our boots, froze our bread solid, cracked the metal of our rifles. We weren't prepared. Our coats were thin, our boots made for autumn. We wrapped our feet in rags, stuffed straw into our uniforms, stole blankets from villages. It didn't matter. Men froze in their sleep. You'd wake to find the man beside you stiff, his eyes open, his mouth frozen mid-breath. We dug trenches in frozen earth as hard as stone. Shovels broke. We used bayonets and bare hands until our nails split and bled. The ground gave nothing. We huddled in shallow pits, the snow piling over us, the wind howling. The Soviets counterattacked in December. They came in white camouflage, moving across the snow like ghosts. They struck at night, their skis whispering, their rifles cracking. We fired blindly into the dark. Sometimes the flashes lit their faces for a second before they vanished. The cold made us clumsy. Rifles jammed, bolts frozen, machine guns wouldn't fire. I pissed on a barrel once to thaw it. My urine froze before it hit the ground. We carried grenades inside our coats to keep them warm. Food was worse. Bread froze like stone. We broke it with rifle butts, chewed until our teeth cracked. Soup was just warm water with a film of grease. We boiled horse bones, gnawed leather straps. I saw a man eat straw, another chew wood, desperate for something to fill his stomach. One comrade slit the throat of a stray dog and lapped the blood from the snow. Disease spread, lice, dysentery, frostbite. Feet turned black, fingers dropped off. One man pulled his boot off and his toes stayed inside. He laughed, then cried like a child. Another's nose turned black and fell away. We bandaged him with rags, but the smell of rot filled the trench. Men went mad. One walked out into the snow naked, singing, saying he was going home. We found him in the morning, stiff as a statue, arms spread wide. Another sat staring at a candle for hours. When it went out, he shot himself. No one even flinched. I wrote letters home, but I lied. I told my wife I was healthy, that we would be home by spring. I didn't tell her about the lice crawling in my beard, the frost cracks bleeding on my hands, the screams at night. I didn't tell her I had stopped feeling human. We carried the wounded on sleds made from doors and fences. Some begged us to leave them, others begged for a bullet. We couldn't. Orders said no mercy. We dragged them until they died, then left them in the snow. Their eyes stared at us from the drifts, accusing. One night our position was shelled. Snow and earth erupted, men buried alive in the pits. I dug with numb fingers, pulled out a comrade half frozen, his face blue. He opened his mouth and ice cracked on his lips. He whispered, "Water." I had none. He died in my arms, his head frozen to my coat. The sky was always grey. The air always howled. The snow never stopped. We were ghosts long before we died. In January I stopped writing. My last words on paper were, "We cannot hold. We are dying every day. If I don't return, know that I loved you." They never found my body. Perhaps I still lie there, under the snow, one of the thousands swallowed by the first Russian winter. Ernst Vogel was 30 years old, a sergeant in the 131st Infantry Regiment, 9th Infantry Division, Army Group Center. He spent the winter of 1942 to 43 near the town of Rozhev, a sector that devoured entire divisions in ceaseless Soviet assaults. His testimony comes from a diary found in his effects when he was killed in March 1943, buried under a collapsed dugout after an artillery strike. They called Rozhev the meat grinder. We didn't know it at first. When we arrived in late autumn of 1942, we thought it was just another sector, another muddy Russian town. Within weeks we understood. The trenches stretched for miles, shallow scars cut into black earth, filled with mud, ice, and bodies. We dug until our hands bled, until our nails tore off. The earth gave nothing. When it froze, it was like concrete. When it thawed, it was bottomless mud. Every trench stank of piss, smoke, and decay. The Soviets never stopped attacking. Day, night, rain, snow. It didn't matter. They came in waves, shouting, firing, throwing grenades. We mowed them down with machine guns, with rifles, with mortars. Still they came. The fields were littered with corpses, frozen in grotesque shapes, eyes staring, mouths open. We used them as sandbags, as barricades, as steps in the mud. Artillery never stopped. Day and night, the earth shook. Shells buried us alive, blew us apart, shredded our nerves. The sky flashed red, the air filled with smoke. We stopped reacting after a while. A shell could land 2 meters away, and we wouldn't even duck. If it was yours, it was yours. The cold was as much an enemy as the Russians. Water froze in our canteens, bread shattered like glass, fingers went black. One soldier pulled off his boot, and his toes came with it, stuck to the wool. He fainted. Another had his hands frostbitten so badly he couldn't hold a rifle. We strapped it to him anyway. Food was a joke. A thin soup, a chunk of black bread, sometimes horse meat, often nothing. We boiled belts, chewed leather, gnawed wood. I saw a man suck marrow from a frozen bone he dug out of the earth. The lice were endless. They crawled in every seam of our clothes, biting, breeding. We scratched until we bled. Some men burned their shirts, risking freezing just for relief. We slept in dugouts half filled with water, rats running over us. The rats ate better than we did, gnawing on corpses, bold enough to bite our fingers as we slept. Men broke down. One night, a comrade started laughing in the trench. He laughed until he cried, then shot himself. Another wandered into no man's land, shouting for his mother, and was cut down by machine gun fire. We buried him in the mud, though buried is the wrong word. We just pushed earth over him and moved on. The Soviets used everything: mortars, Katyusha rockets, tanks, even women snipers. You'd be standing in the trench and a bullet would rip through a helmet 2 inches from your skull. We stopped looking around. We just stared at the mud, waiting. The ground itself was made of death. You dig and hit bones, rotting flesh, boots still filled with feet. Graves collapsed into trenches. Sometimes hands stuck out of the walls. We cut them off with shovels and kept digging. Once we counterattacked. Out of the trench, through the mud, screaming, bayonets fixed. We charged across no man's land filled with bodies. Bullets snapped past, shells burst around us. Men fell left and right, splashing into the muck. I stabbed a Soviet in the chest, felt his warm blood on my hands. He grabbed my sleeve as he fell. His eyes stayed open. I shook him off and kept running. We gained a few meters. Then the artillery came. Shells rained down, blasting us apart. I threw myself into a crater filled with water and corpses. For hours I lay there, ears ringing, teeth chattering, surrounded by floating bodies. When I crawled back, I was alone. We stopped counting days. Time didn't exist. Just cold, mud, hunger, fire. We lived like animals, and even animals live better. In February, the Soviets attacked with everything they had. Our trenches collapsed under bombardment. We fought with knives, with entrenching tools, with bare hands. Men screamed in the dark, blood spraying, bayonets flashing. I smashed a Soviet's head with a shovel. His skull split like ice. I didn't think, I just swung again and again until he stopped moving. By March, half my company was gone. Some killed, some frozen, some simply vanished. I wrote one last entry. This is not war. This is slaughter. We are not men anymore. We are shadows, waiting for the earth to swallow us. Days later, a shell buried our dugout. They pulled bodies out, but not me. I remained under the earth at Rzhev, one more ghost in the meat grinder. Karl Hoffmann was 24 years old, a private in the 305th Infantry Division, trapped in the southern sector of Stalingrad when the Soviet pincers closed in November 1942. His diary, recovered from his frozen body after the surrender in February 1943, tells of the final weeks inside the Kessel, weeks of starvation, madness, and death. When the encirclement closed, we told ourselves it was only temporary. The Luftwaffe would resupply us, we said. A corridor would be opened, we said. We believed it because we had to. But weeks passed, and nothing came but snow, hunger, and death. By December, the rations had vanished. Bread became a scrap of black crust, thinner than paper. Horse meat was a luxury, tough, stringy, and frozen, but we devoured it like kings. When the horses were gone, we turned to whatever we could find. We boiled leather straps, belts, boots. We chewed paper, cloth, anything to trick our stomachs. Some men ate candle wax, others ate rats, if they could catch them. The cold was constant, -30, -40. Our boots froze to the ground. Our coats turned stiff with ice, fingers blackened and fell off. I wrapped rags around my hands until they were soaked with blood. Every morning we found men stiff in their foxholes, eyes open, beards white with frost. The cellars were worse. We packed into ruins, hundreds of us, huddled like animals. The air stank of sweat, smoke, rot. Men coughed blood, spat black phlegm. Typhus spread. Lice crawled in every seam of our clothes, biting until our skin bled. We scratched until we tore our flesh. We stopped caring about the dead. There were too many. They lay in corners, stacked like firewood, frozen stiff. We used them as benches, as barricades against the wind. Once, I slept beside a corpse because his body gave more warmth than the rags I wore. A comrade, Müller, went mad with hunger. He swore he saw his mother in the ruins, carrying bread and soup. He ran into the snow without boots, shouting her name. We found him the next day, frozen, his face eaten by rats. Another man cut flesh from a dead horse and roasted it on a fire. Others watched him with wide eyes. The next day the horse was stripped to the bone. I saw worse. A comrade roasted meat in secret. It smelled wrong. Some whispered it was human. No one spoke. We just watched him eat. Every night the Soviets shelled us. The sky glowed red. The earth shook. Rubble fell. Men screamed in the dark, buried alive in cellars. We dug with bare hands, nails breaking, fingers bleeding. Sometimes we pulled out a body with no head. Sometimes we heard the screams stop before we reached them. The fighting never stopped. Soviets attacked through the ruins, through the sewers, across the frozen Volga. We fought with rifles when we had them, pistols, knives, spades. When the ammunition ran out, we fought with bricks, with fists, with teeth. One day a comrade smashed a Russian's skull with a hammer. He laughed, then wept, then laughed again. Our sergeant shot himself in January. He left no note. He just sat in a corner, put his pistol in his mouth and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed in the cellar. Blood sprayed the wall. No one moved. We just sat, staring. I lost all sense of time. Days and nights blended into one endless nightmare of hunger, cold and fire. My body was weak, my mind broken. I dreamed of food, of warmth, of home. Then I woke to rubble and death. My last entry was short. No food, no hope, only snow and fire. I was found frozen in February, a scrap of paper still in my pocket. My words ended there, as the 6th Army ended, swallowed by Stalingrad. Wilhelm Kranz was 29 years old, a platoon commander in the 58th Infantry Division. His unit was part of Army Group North, stationed in the forests and swamps around Leningrad during the first winter of the siege. He survived only until February 1942, when frostbite and typhus carried him off. His diary, smuggled home after the war, shows what life was like on the frozen front lines outside the city. When we reached the outskirts of Leningrad in September, we thought the war was won. The Soviets were retreating everywhere, the city surrounded on 3 sides. We could see the smoke rising from the chimneys, hear the distant rumble of trams. We thought it would collapse like the others, like Kiev, like Minsk. But Leningrad did not collapse. It just sat there, silent, stubborn, cursed, and the winter came. By November, the forests turned white. By December, the snow was higher than our waists. Temperatures plunged to -40. Our rifles froze solid, our boots cracked, our coats stiffened with ice. The trenches were useless. They filled with snow and water, froze into glass. We slept in dugouts carved into the earth, lined with planks stolen from barns. The walls wept with frost, candles froze. The food rations grew smaller every week, a crust of black bread, a smear of fat, thin soup that tasted of nothing. Horses were slaughtered first, then the dogs. After that, nothing but boiled roots, frozen turnips, and what we could steal from the peasants. Some peasants fought back with axes and pitchforks. Some wept and handed over the last potatoes they had. Their children stared at us with hollow eyes. Disease spread like fire. Lice crawled in every seam of our uniforms. Dysentery left men too weak to stand. Frostbite blackened hands and feet. Fingers dropped off like twigs. Toes rotted in boots. The field hospitals were full of moaning, stinking men, their wounds infested with maggots, their breath stinking of rot. There was no morphine. They stuffed rags in mouths and cut with saws. At night, the Soviets struck. Ski patrols slipped through the forests, their white cloaks invisible in the snow. Snipers picked off sentries one by one. Sometimes we found their bodies mutilated, eyes gouged, ears cut off. Sometimes we found nothing but red stains in the snow. The bombardment from the city never stopped. Artillery shells rained down, smashing our dugouts, scattering splinters of wood and bone. The ground shook, men screamed. Sometimes we dug comrades out still alive, covered in frost and blood. Other times all we found were legs or an arm sticking from the rubble. The worst was the silence. Weeks without movement, only the wind howling through the trees, the snow falling, the endless white. Men lost their minds. One sat for days staring at a block of ice. Another carved wooden figures of naked women, lined them up, and talked to them as if they were real. Another wandered into the forest at night, naked, laughing, and never came back. We heard stories of what was happening inside the city. Civilians eating wallpaper paste, boiling shoe leather, cutting meat from the dead. We thought it was propaganda until a Soviet prisoner admitted it. He wept as he spoke, his lips cracked, his teeth broken. He said his family had eaten their dog, then his neighbor's child. He begged us to shoot him. I stopped writing long letters home. What could I say? That I had frostbitten feet, lice in my beard, rot in my lungs, that I dreamed of bread every night, woke with my mouth full of blood from gnawing my tongue. I wrote only, I am alive for now. In January, I knew I would not last. My feet were black, my fingers numb. I coughed blood into the snow. Every step was pain, every breath a knife. I wrote one last line in my diary before the fever took me. Leningrad is not a city, it is a graveyard, and I will be buried here too. Wilhelm died in his dugout in February 1942. His body was thrown into a frozen trench with dozens of others, covered with snow and forgotten. His words, carried home by a survivor, remain the only trace of his voice. Joseph Brandt was 25 years old, a gunner in a Panzer IV of the Panzergrenadier Division Großdeutschland. He fought in the southern pincer of Operation Citadel, near the village of Prokhorovka. His testimony was reconstructed from fragments of a diary and from comrades' accounts before he was killed when his tank was destroyed on July 13, 1943. When we were told we would be part of the attack at Kursk, we thought it would be like before. A quick breakthrough, Russian units encircled, another great victory. The officers said this would be the blow to end the war in the east. We believed them, or at least we wanted to. On the morning of July 5th, the sky shook. Thousands of guns opened fire, the horizon flashing with fire, the air filled with dust. Our tanks rolled forward in endless lines, engines roaring, tracks grinding, exhaust choking the air. The ground trembled beneath us. Inside the tank, it was like living in a coffin made of iron. The air was stifling, the noise deafening, the engine behind us, the clank of shells, the rattle of the turret. Sweat poured down our faces. The stench of oil, fuel, and cordite filled our lungs. Every breath was thick, every heartbeat loud. The Russians were waiting. Their defences were endless. Mines, trenches, barbed wire, anti-tank guns, hidden in every bush, every copse of trees. The first mine exploded under a panzer ahead of us. The tank rose into the air and came down burning. The crew scrambled out, clothes on fire, screaming. One fell, rolling in the dust, still burning. Another was cut down by machine gun fire before he even reached cover. We fired at bunkers, at flashes in the trees, at shadows. Our shells tore through earth and wood, but the Soviets kept firing. Anti-tank shells slammed into our armour, rattling the turret, making our ears ring. One hit the side, denting the plate, sending shards of metal flying inside. The loader screamed as splinters cut his face. Everywhere was fire, smoke, and noise. Tanks burning, black smoke rising, men running between craters. The sky roared with Stukas, but the Russians had their own planes too, swooping low, firing rockets. A bomber exploded above us, raining down metal. The ground was littered with wrecks. Panzer IVs burning, T-34s burning, corpses trapped inside, their fists pounding on hatches until the fire silenced them. Some crews never got out. You could hear them screaming as their tanks turned into ovens. The smell was unforgettable. Burning oil, burning flesh, a stench that clung to your clothes, your skin, your soul. On July 12th, near Prokhorovka, it became worse. Hundreds of Soviet tanks charged us. Wave after wave, the ground shook like an earthquake. Dust rose in clouds. Their engines roared, their guns thundered. It was like facing a steel tide. We fired as fast as we could, shell after shell. Tanks exploded, turrets blown off, tracks torn apart. But still they came, closer and closer. At 500 meters, 300, 100. Some crashed into our own wrecks, others rammed our tanks head-on. It was chaos, metal grinding, shells screaming, men shouting, dying. Inside the tank, it was madness. Sweat poured, ears rang, hands blistered. I loaded and fired until my arms ached, my head pounding, my eyes burning. Every impact shook us like a hammer. A shell struck the side. The armor held, but the shock knocked me to the floor. Blood filled my mouth. I saw a T-34 ram a Tiger ahead of us. Both burst into flames. The crews tried to get out, but machine gun fire cut them down. Another Soviet tank exploded so close the shock wave ripped our radio out of its bolts. My ears bled. By evening, the field was a graveyard of steel. Dozens of wrecks burning, ammunition cooking off, smoke rising like a black curtain. The ground was covered in corpses, some still inside tanks, others half buried in craters, their bodies twisted, their faces black. We thought we had won. We had knocked out so many of them, but more came, always more. The Soviets did not stop. For every tank we destroyed, 2 more appeared. For every man who fell, another charged with a grenade in hand. On July 13th, our luck ended. A shell hit us from the side. The armor cracked. Flames burst in. The loader screamed, his body on fire. The driver clawed at the hatch, but it jammed. I tried to open mine, but the heat seared my hands. Smoke filled the turret, choking me. I don't remember what happened after that. All they found later was the wreck of our Panzer, burned out, blackened. Inside were only bones and ashes. My diary, half burned, lay in the dirt outside. Otto Reiser was 26 years old, a private in the 305th Infantry Division, 6th Army. When the Soviet encirclement closed in November 1942, his unit was cut off in the southern sector of the city. He survived for weeks in a half-collapsed cellar near the Red October factory, surrounded by rubble, corpses, and comrades wasting away from hunger and cold. His final account was pieced together from letters he never managed to send, and notes found in his paybook after his death. What follows is his testimony. We stopped being soldiers in December. By January, we were something else. Shadows, skeletons, animals clawing at the snow for food. Stalingrad was no longer a battle, it was a graveyard. The cold was endless. -30, -40. Our breath froze on our beards. Our boots cracked like old leather. We wrapped rags around our hands until they froze solid with blood and filth. Fingers blackened and fell off. A comrade, Franz, lost 3 toes in one night. He didn't even feel them go. In the morning they were gone, stuck to the inside of his boot. He wept, not from pain, but because he knew it meant he would never walk again. The cellars were worse than the trenches. We crowded into ruins with holes in the walls, the wind cutting through like knives. Dozens of us, packed together, coughing, shivering, scratching at lice. The lice never stopped. They crawled in every seam, biting until we bled. We scratched ourselves raw until scabs crusted over our skin. Some men burned their shirts just to kill the swarms. The hunger consumed everything. Rations were gone weeks ago. Bread became a black scrap, thinner than paper, hard as stone. We boiled leather straps, belts, boots. We chewed wood. We ate candle wax. One day a rat ran across the rubble. We pounced like wolves. Its bones were shared between 6 men. I sucked marrow from the legs like it was soup. At night the Soviets shelled us. The ground shook, rubble fell, dust filled our throats. Sometimes we dug out comrades buried alive. Other times we just heard muffled screams fade into silence under the ruins. The shelling became part of life, a drumbeat that never ended. I can still smell it. Smoke, ash, blood, rot. Corpses were everywhere, frozen stiff in the snow, piled in corners of cellars, used as barricades against the wind. We stopped burying the dead. The ground was too hard, and there were too many. Some bodies lay for weeks, their faces gnawed by rats, their limbs stiff. We used them as benches, as sandbags, as shields. At first it sickened us. Then we stopped noticing. Hallucinations haunted us. A comrade, Müller, swore he saw his mother outside the factory gates with soup and bread. He ran into the snow without boots. We found him the next day, frozen, his eyes pecked by crows. Another man said he heard church bells every night. There were no bells in Stalingrad, only the howl of the wind and the thunder of guns. I saw worse. One night a man roasted meat in secret. The smell drew us in. It was sweet, strange. When he dozed off, another lifted the rag covering the pot. It was a human arm, half burned. No one spoke. We just turned away. By morning, the man was gone. No one asked where. We fought when we had to, but fighting was madness. Ammunition was nearly gone. Sometimes only a handful of rounds per man. We fought with knives, shovels, bricks. Once in a cellar, I killed a Russian with my entrenching tool. I split his skull like wood. His blood sprayed the wall. I didn't feel triumph, only emptiness. The Soviets came closer every day. Their shouts echoed through the ruins. Their machine guns rattled. Their Katyushas screamed overhead. They had food, warmth, reinforcements. We had nothing but rubble. We knew the end was coming. By mid-January, men were collapsing in the streets, skeletons wrapped in rags. Some begged to be shot. Others just lay in the snow and waited. I wrote letters I never sent, scraps of paper hidden in my paybook. Mother, I am alive, but I cannot last. The worst moment came when our sergeant shot himself. He sat in the corner, silent, then put his pistol in his mouth and pulled the trigger. The blood sprayed across the frost-covered wall. No one moved. No one spoke. We just stared, then went back to scratching lice. I lost track of time. Days and nights blurred together. Hunger gnawed, cold froze, death surrounded us. I dreamed of bread, of home, of warmth. I woke to ash, rubble, and silence. I knew I would not leave Stalingrad alive. I did not fear death anymore. I feared only that no one would know how we died, not as soldiers in victory, but as men rotting in the snow. After New Year's, the city changed sound. Before it was shells and machine guns and the constant moan of the wind through broken windows. After the encirclement tightened and the airfields began to fall, there was a new sound, the scraping shuffle of starving men. It came from every stairwell, every cellar, boots too big on legs too thin, soles dragging, canteens clinking empty. Whole companies became columns of beggars. On the 8th of January, Soviet loudspeakers boomed across the ruins. A voice like a schoolteacher read an offer, humane treatment, food, medical care, if we laid down our arms. Surrender and live, it said in careful German. Our lieutenant laughed once, a dry bark, and ordered a patrol forward. He was dead by nightfall, a sniper's neat hole through his forehead. The next day they dropped leaflets. Passierscheine, safe conduct passes with fat black letters promising bread. We used a handful to light a stove in the cellar. The others we kept, because the paper looked like bread. Pitomnik airfield went first. We heard it in rumours that moved faster than any courier. Closed, overrun, last plane, wounded left on the runway. A man in my platoon swore he saw men clinging to the landing gear as a transport lifted off, their fingers pried loose by the slipstream, dots falling into the snow. 2 days later, the same voices said Gomrak was the last hope. They'll evacuate us, someone insisted, as if saying it could make it true. The doctor in our sector was a thin Bavarian with shaking hands. He cut away black flesh in a storage room that stank of kerosene and pus. We called it the theatre. There was no morphine left. He used a bottle of schnapps for the worst cases. Most of us got a stick to bite on. He sawed through a corporal's foot while we held the man down, his eyes rolling, his jaw working. The saw made a soft, dry sound. When it was over, the doctor fainted. We propped him in a chair and tied a tourniquet ourselves. The corporal bled out anyway. We buried the foot in the wall to keep the rats off it. The man we laid by the door with the others, frozen in minutes, his eyelashes white with frost. We learned to speak in numbers. 6 rounds. 3 men fit to stand. 1 can of horse. 2 liters of melt. We pulled snow through old bandages to strain out the soot and brick dust. It still tasted like the city, burnt, metallic, faintly sweet from whatever chemicals leaked out of the smashed factories. Water was the currency of everything, friendship, obedience, hope. I gave half my ration to Franz after they took his toes. He died in his sleep that night, eyes open, mouth stiff. I took my water back, Soviet snipers owned the daylight. A broken chimney here, a collapsed rafter's shadow there. One blink and a man would fold up like a puppet with its strings cut. We moved in tunnels of rubble, walls made of wardrobes and stoves stacked on bricks, sheets hung to break a silhouette. The best snipers waited for habits, the man who always chose the same gap in the bricks to piss through, the boy who liked to warm his hands near the same crack of sunlight at noon, the runner who popped his head up to listen before making a dash. We stopped having habits. They pushed with flame. The first time I saw a flamethrower sweep a cellar, I thought the world itself had turned liquid and orange. The heat had weight. It pushed the air ahead of it. Men lit up like paper. The skin on a face shrivels in an instant. The mouth becomes a black O. The scream oddly soft under the roar. After that, we filled the cellar entrances with rubble and snow, left only one hole we could collapse ourselves with a crate and a kick. We kept a grenade by the hole in case we decided it was better that way. My friend Kola carried a pocket watch that had belonged to his father. He wound it every morning with blue, cracked fingers. "If the watch stops," he said, "I stop." On the 14th, I heard him winding in the corner, and the spring snapped with a tiny ping. He stared at it a long time, and then he lay down and didn't get up again. He was dead the next day. Someone took the chain. The sky kept dropping promises that weren't meant for us. Parachutes bloomed in the pale light and drifted like dandelion heads. We ran for them when they fell on our side of the lines. Sometimes they were food, frozen tins, hard as stones. Once we opened one with a bayonet and found nothing but packeted seeds and winter coats cut for Luftwaffe ground crew. Another time we fought 3 men from the next cellar for a crate that turned out to hold only radio batteries. I saw men cry over batteries. They say you can smell surrender days before it happens. I think that's true. There's a sweetness that creeps into the air when living things begin to rot before they die. It was in our breath and our clothes, in the rags we wrapped around our feet, even in the paper of my paybook where I wrote these lines. We stopped shaving, the beard froze to the scarf froze to the jacket to the skin. If you pulled anything away too fast, you took the skin with it. The doctor told us not to sleep unless someone kept watch. Men sleep into death at 30 below. We tried. The watch nodded off. We woke to a man whose face had turned to marble. On the 16th, 4 men went out at dusk to barter with a Feld gendarmerie detachment rumoured to have a sack of flour. They took rings, watches, even a silver tooth wrapped in tissue. They returned with a little canvas bag and the look of men who had seen a miracle. It wasn't flour, it was plaster. They had paid in gold for ground plaster of Paris. We stood around the bag a long time, then we mixed it with snow and ate it anyway. It set in our mouths like chalk and made us sick for 2 days. I passed blood. We kept eating. Somewhere in those days, gum rack went. We only understood because the sky went empty. No more parachutes, no more growl of engines at night. The last plane that tried to land, they said, skidded on ice and smashed into wrecks at the runway's edge. The wounded limped out to it, dragging themselves through fire and tracer. I don't know if any of them made it aboard. The story changed with each retelling. All rescued, all shot, all burned, all left behind. In Stalingrad, every story is true for a minute. Our officer, what was left of him, his belt 2 notches tighter every week, read a Tagesbefehl from the radio tender one morning. It was formal, stiff with words about duty and honour and the future of Europe. We stared at the stove hole like children listening to rain. When he finished, the stove went out. January ground its teeth. We took a position in a half-collapsed workers' dormitory, rooms on one side open like the cross-section of a dollhouse. In one room a piano lay on its back, strings bright as veins in the grey light. I hit a key with a mitten and nothing happened. Someone had cut the strings to make snares and ties. In another room a dog was frozen to the floor, ribs like a comb. Only the head and paws were left. The rest had gone over many days, careful cuts with a bayonet. We learned to look for them now, little neat squares where flesh had been. We tried not to look at the humans the same way. On the 21st, the Soviets came in through the laundry and out the stairwell. We met in a corridor of lime dust and pipes. Their submachine guns were hoses of sparks. We dropped to our elbows, fired up into bellies, flinched at the flash of a grenade, and felt brick bite our faces. We drove them back room by room, a spade at the door, a bayonet through a coat, boots slipping in slurry. I looked down and realized we were staggering on laundry soap. It got into the shallow cuts of our hands and stung like needles. The man I stabbed was a boy. He bled a thin, watery pink. I told myself he had been shooting at me. I don't know if it was true. I took his gloves. They were warmer than mine. They say the battle line was sometimes a hallway thick and sometimes only a landing. I can tell you there were days when the enemy was on the far side of a door. They listened when we breathed. We listened when they whispered. The door was a ruin and we had plugged it with a wardrobe. Once someone sneezed and 4 shots came through the oak. We dragged a corpse into the gap and the next bullet hit him instead. Hunger coughs have their own sound, wet and low, with a catch. They shake a man, his whole body shivering. We feared them as much as artillery because you couldn't stop them and they gave you away. We pushed the worst of the coffers to the back, then farther back, then out. They didn't come back. In the last week of January, the sky turned the colour of old fat. Smoke lay on the city like a second city. A rumour said our general had been promoted. Another said he was sick. Another said he had already surrendered. The loudspeakers tailored their voice for each rumour. Officers, they said, lay down your arms, save your men. Then they played a gramophone record of a German waltz. A few of us hummed. The doctor wept. On the 28th, my feet turned to blocks. I had wrapped them, changed the rags when I could, rubbed them with snow as we were told, but something final had happened in the night. The skin was grey and hard and made no sound when I thumped it with a fist. The doctor pinched a toe until the nail bruised and I felt nothing. He looked away. Not today, he said when I asked about the sore. There is no today, I said, and he laughed. That scared me more than anything. We heard an engine at dusk, not a plane, a tank. The sound filled the yard like a sermon. The wall shook, plaster ticking down on our helmets. The tank prowled along the street, its gun slow as a clock hand, stopping at each opening and sending one round through. The floor jumped. Dust came down like snow. We crouched under a steel bed frame and sang a children's song through our teeth without meaning to. When the tank moved on, we stood up together, grey men in a grey room, and every one of us had pissed himself. No one said a word. The cold stung us back to life. I bartered my last possession, a little silver locket with a photograph of my sister, for a crust of bread from a supply corporal who still had a stash somewhere. I took it back to the cellar and cut it into 4 parts with my bayonet, one for each man there, and I counted us lucky. We ate in silence, the way animals eat when they're afraid of losing the food. The bread tasted of fuel and mouse droppings and holiness. On the 30th, the sky to the south had an orange bloom that didn't die with nightfall. Someone said the Soviets had reached the department store downtown, where a headquarters had been. Someone else said they'd blown a hole in our last line on the river. We had stopped using grid references, we used landmarks, and sometimes even those were lies because the landmarks had burned down or fallen. Where? A man asked. Where the bakery used to be, came the answer. We nodded. We remembered bread like a place. I wrote a letter to my mother I would never send. I told her I had kept my hands clean. It was a lie, but I wanted her to be warm for 1 minute when she read it, years from now, if years were still going to exist. Part 3. The End. On the 31st, we heard it as a change in the air. The shooting did not stop, not really, but it stepped back a pace, as if the storm had gone across the street. The men in our cellar listened with our heads tilted like dogs. Somewhere, they said, someone had stopped. A runner brought a word, capitulation, then another word, sectors. North keeps fighting, someone said. South is finished. We didn't know if we were north or south. Our compass had frozen months ago, and the sun hadn't climbed above the smoke in weeks. At noon, a Soviet soldier slid a white rag under the wardrobe that blocked our door. We stared at it for a long time, like it was a new animal we hadn't seen before. The word surrender hung in the cellar like a bad smell. Our youngest man vomited and then said he was sorry. The doctor said we had nothing to be sorry for. He tucked his bloody sore into a canvas bag and tied it with a string. We argued without raising our voices because shouting hurt, and because we no longer believed that volume did anything in the world. We had 5 rifles between 9 men, 17 rounds, 2 grenades with the pins bent straight with pliers. The doctor said he would go out first and speak. He had been a schoolmaster before the war. He believed in sentences. We pushed the wardrobe a hand's breadth, then a hand's breadth more. Cold poured in like water. The white rag moved again, as if a wind had it. I swallowed and tasted iron. We slid the furniture back enough to crawl out one by one, hands up. The yard was a world of broken brick drifted like snow. Telegraph wires hung with icicles. A truck without wheels perched on its axles like a dead insect. Men in quilted coats stood with their guns at their hips. Their faces were red where the cold had bitten. One of them grinned at me, not cruelly, more in amazement that I still looked like a man. They took our names. They took our watches if any were left, our rings if our fingers weren't too swollen. They took the doctor's saw and handed it to a boy who turned it over like a toy and laughed. A commissar with a clean collar wrote in a notebook until his pencil broke. He sharpened it with a knife and kept writing. The world felt very orderly for 10 minutes. They took us into a school that smelled faintly of chalk under the stink of men. There were drawings still on the walls, triangles, a boat, a tree with a hole in the trunk, and bullet holes through them. They gave us bowls with something thin in them and a piece of bread each. The stew had meat in it or something that had been meat in a better life. I ate and felt my stomach cramp. My body didn't remember how to accept such bounty. A guard touched my arm and made a motion to eat more slowly. I tried. I could not. I wolfed it and vomited, and then cried out of shame, and the guard made a small, sympathetic sound like a father. He handed me his canteen and watched until I stopped shaking. That night they marched us toward a collecting point. The snow glowed with the reflected fires of the city dying behind us. The line of men stretched into the dark, careful not to step on the frozen shapes that lay by the path. We passed a place I recognized only by a smell, where a bakery had been months ago. Someone in the line started laughing, a cracked, beautiful sound, and I knew he had recognized it too. He laughed until he coughed blood. Men fell. If you fell, you were hauled up by the man behind you, or you did not get up. I fell once. Hands as rough as rope pulled me by the armpits, and my head smacked a wagon, and I saw sparks, and I thought it was summer. They put us in a shed or a barn or a factory room. Any space was all spaces now. The floor was covered in sawdust and old straw and lice that had been waiting for new hosts. A man near me muttered numbers, 201, 202. He said it was steps to the latrine and back. It kept him alive because he had a job to do. Count. When he fell asleep, I took up the count softly in my head, so the world would not break. I do not know if numbers can hold up a roof, but that night they did. Fever found me at last. It came like a friend who'd been walking behind me for months and only now caught up. It put its arm around my shoulders and whispered that I could lie down, that there was at last a bed, that there was at last an end. My feet swelled and burst and the fluid froze in my socks. The doctor, our doctor no longer, just a man with a bag, looked at them and shook his head once. He had nothing left to take off. He tucked a rag under my heels so the straw would not fuse to me. I dreamed of a room in our house where the sun came in at 4 p.m. in September and made a bar on the table. I dreamed of my sister brushing her hair. I dreamed of a loaf, nothing fancy, just our bread with the brown heel cut thick, and the sound it makes when the knife goes through the crust and the crumb answers. I woke with my mouth open, and a little snow had drifted in. Somewhere in those days, a man with a medical badge on his hat took my paybook and read the pages I had written. He traced the words with a finger and nodded and put the book back in my pocket like a priest replacing a relic. Gut, he said quietly, though he was not German. Gut. He spoke to me as if I would be around to hear him in a week. I loved him for that lie. They say the surrender was formal on the 2nd of February, that a general signed a paper and a city exhaled. In the shed, barn, factory, there were no papers. There were only men measuring out breaths. I measured mine like bread. It seemed important not to waste any. I do not remember the last thing I wrote. It may have been a name. It may have been water. It may have been nothing but a line that starts and stops where my hand slipped. Postscript, 3rd person. When a Soviet burial detail cleared the shed weeks later, they found Otto Reiser among the dead on the straw, thin as a fence slat, his cheeks fallen in like punctured tins. In his tunic pocket lay a paybook stiff with frost. On several pages a cramped hand had written dates, places, Red October, Gumrack, no bread, and sentences that dwindled into lines. One note was legible. Tell them we were men once. They buried him in a trench with others whose names could not be read. The paybook went into a bundle of papers handed to a clerk, then to a drawer, then to a file. Years later, a historian opened it and copied the pages. Otto's voice, thin, stubborn, ordinary, crossed the decades. It said nothing new about Stalingrad, and everything essential. That there was hunger and cold, and a city that swallowed men. That the last thing a soldier thinks of is bread and a bar of sunlight on an old kitchen table. That a man can vanish into a place and still leave behind a line that says simply, "We were here." Wilhelm Krauss was 27 years old, a sergeant in the 6th Company of the SS Division Totenkopf. In February 1942, his unit was trapped inside the Demyansk pocket, a vast swathe of forest and frozen swamps where more than 90,000 German troops were encircled by the Red Army. For months they endured starvation, frostbite, ceaseless Soviet attacks, and the failure of promised relief. His testimony was reconstructed from letters intercepted by censors, fragments in his diary, and recollections noted after the war. We went into the pocket in columns of steel and came out months later as scarecrows. That is, those of us who came out at all. The rest stayed there beneath the snow or in shallow pits that filled with water in spring. The encirclement closed at the end of February. At first we laughed off the idea. We had fought our way deep into Russia before. We thought we would fight our way out again. But this was not like the summer of 41. The Soviets were stronger, cleverer, more determined. The thaw had not yet come, and the forests and swamps froze solid, trapping us like insects in amber. Our positions were scattered across villages that had become nothing more than names. Byakovo, Chervenoye, Velikije Dubovici. The Soviets pressed from all sides, attacking with mortars, machine guns, and endless waves of infantry. We dug in wherever we could, behind barn walls, in frozen trenches, in cellars where the smoke from our fires choked us, but kept us from freezing. Food vanished first. The quartermaster rationed bread to 200 grams a day, then 100. Black, mouldy bread that crumbled like ash in our hands. We boiled straw, chewed bark, slaughtered the last horses for meat. The soup was grey and greasy, thick with hooves and hides. Men quarrelled over scraps. I saw one corporal beaten nearly to death for stealing a sack of dried peas from a field kitchen. The air supply was a curse disguised as hope. Planes droned above us, Ju-52s lumbering through the clouds, parachutes blossoming white in the grey sky. Sometimes the loads fell on Soviet lines. Sometimes they burst in the air. Once a crate landed in our trench. We tore it open with bayonets, praying for bread or fat. It was boots, the wrong size, stiff with frozen grease. We cursed and wore them anyway. We slept in holes under branches, pressed together like corpses in a pit. The cold was an enemy more cruel than the Red Army. It bit our fingers, blackened our toes, froze water in canteens before we could drink. Frostbite spread like rot. One man lost both hands. They hung black at his wrists like gloves until the medic cut them away with shears. The Soviets attacked nightly. Mortar bombs fell like iron hail, splitting trees, showering us with splinters. Their infantry came screaming, bayonets fixed, through the snowdrifts. We cut them down with machine gun fire, but they kept coming. Sometimes they overran a position and we fought hand to hand, knives and shovels in the moonlight, boots slipping in blood and snow. I remember a night near the village of Staragia Rusa. They charged again and again across the ice of a frozen marsh. We fired until our barrels smoked. Bodies piled on the ice, crimson spreading beneath them. When morning came, crows and wolves picked at the frozen dead. Their faces were locked in grimaces of rage, their eyes glazed white. I stared at them for hours, thinking they looked no different from us. Disease was everywhere. Dysentery turned our trenches into sewers. Men shat themselves to death, too weak to crawl out of the dugout. Lice swarmed in our seams, feeding on us until our skin bled. Some soldiers set their uniforms on fire just to kill them, then froze naked while waiting for replacement clothes that never came. We stopped writing letters honestly. The censors forbade despair, so we lied. All is well, we wrote. The fighting is hard, but spirits are high. Meanwhile, men lay moaning in corners, their feet black, their stomachs empty, their will gone. Our commander promised relief. He said the Führer would never abandon us. Hold fast, comrades, he told us. Reinforcements are coming. But weeks passed, then months. Reinforcements never came. only more orders to hold, to resist, to die where we stood if necessary. In April, the thaw began. The snow melted into a sea of mud. Our trenches collapsed. The bodies we had buried shallow floated to the surface, faces green, eyes eaten by rats. We dug them back under, then gave up. The land itself was rotten. The stench clung to our nostrils until we no longer noticed. I remember a comrade, Ernst, from Munich. He was a baker before the war. He used to tell us about loaves fresh from the oven, their crusts golden, the smell of flour filling his shop. In Demyansk he starved like the rest of us. One morning he slit his wrists with a razor blade. He died with a smile on his lips. We envied him. By May, the pocket still held. The Soviets had tried to crush us and failed. Relief finally came, spearheads cutting narrow corridors through the swamps, roads of planks laid over mud. Supplies trickled in, and the wounded staggered out. But the cost was unbearable. Of our company of 160 men, fewer than 30 remained. We looked like skeletons in rags, our faces hollow, our eyes sunken. When I walked out of the pocket at last, I felt no joy, no triumph, only emptiness. The land behind me was a graveyard without crosses. I carried the weight of comrades who would never leave. Even now, decades later, I hear the wind in the pines, the cough of the dying, the crunch of frozen snow under boots. We called it survival. In truth, it was only endurance, a postponement of death. Johann Meisner was 29 years old, an Oberfeldwebel, sergeant major in the 78th Sturmdivision. By June 1944, his unit held defensive positions east of Minsk, part of Army Group Center. When the Soviets launched Operation Bagration on 22nd June, the German lines collapsed in one of the most devastating defeats of the war. Encircled, starved, and hounded through forests and marshes, Johann recorded fragments of his ordeal in a battered notebook later found on his body. The following is his story. When the summer came, we thought maybe the worst was behind us. After the winter retreats, we dug into Belarus, built bunkers, mined fields, strung wire. The generals told us this would be a strong point, a fortress line. They said the Russians would break their teeth on it. We believed them, or we wanted to. We were tired of retreating. On the morning of the 22nd of June, 3 years to the day after Barbarossa, the sky broke open. Their artillery began at dawn and never stopped. It was like nothing I had heard before. Whole batteries fired in rolling waves, the ground trembling like an earthquake. The earth itself seemed to moan, the air filled with dust, smoke, burning powder. Men clamped hands over their ears until they bled. Some lost their minds, running in circles screaming while shells tore them apart. When the barrage lifted, the ground moved. Soviet infantry poured forward in endless ranks, behind them tanks, T-34s, Shermans sent by America, even heavy IS-2 monsters. Our anti-tank guns fired until the barrels warped. The first waves we cut down, the next kept coming, then more and more. It never stopped. I fired my MG until the barrel glowed red, until the belt was slick with blood and oil. Men fell around me. The bunker roof collapsed. A comrade named Alfred was buried alive, his legs kicking out of the rubble until they stopped. I clawed at the dirt with bleeding fingers, but another shell slammed nearby and threw me into the wall. When I woke, he was gone. By the second day, the line was gone. Whole divisions vanished. Headquarters gave no orders. Radios went silent. We fought in small knots, cut off, surrounded by fire and smoke. We tried to retreat toward Minsk, but the roads were chaos, columns of wagons, broken tanks, burning trucks, refugees mixed with soldiers, horses screaming, aircraft strafing. Soviet planes filled the sky. Yak fighters dived again and again, their machine guns cutting through the crowds. I saw a mother clutching her child, both torn apart by bullets. We pushed them aside and kept running. Survival left no room for pity. The marshes swallowed us. We staggered through waist-high reeds, swarms of mosquitoes, mud that sucked at our boots until some men simply lay down and never rose again. We had no maps, no food, no ammunition beyond what we carried. The Soviets closed the ring tighter every day. Partisans hunted us too. They knew the forests better than we did. At night shots cracked from the trees, and men vanished with throats slit, their boots gone. Once, in a ruined village, we found a well. The water was black with corpses. Still, men drank it, scooping handfuls, gagging on the taste of rot. Dysentery spread like fire. We shat blood in the ditches, too weak to walk. Some kept going anyway, leaving red trails behind them until they collapsed. I saw things I never imagined men could do. One soldier slit the belly of a dead horse and crawled inside for warmth during the night. Another ate raw grain mixed with mud and vomited until he died. I myself chewed grass, roots, even the leather of my belt, just to keep my mouth busy so I wouldn't think of hunger. Near Borisov, we tried to break out. We attacked at night, bayonets fixed, rifles nearly empty. The Soviets were waiting. Flares lit the sky, turning night into day. Machine guns scythed us down. I stepped on bodies soft as mud, slipping in blood, screaming until my voice broke. I don't know how I made it back into the woods, only that others didn't. The heat was unbearable. Flies swarmed the corpses. The stench was everywhere. We walked past endless dead, both German and Russian, swollen in the sun, their eyes eaten by birds. I stopped looking at faces. I remember a boy in my unit, 18 years old, named Kurt. He carried a photograph of his fiancée back home. He looked at it every night. One morning he woke up, looked at the picture, kissed it, then put his pistol in his mouth. We buried him in a shallow grave, used his spade to cover him with earth. Hours later, we were ambushed and had to flee. I never knew if his grave remained or if the rain washed it away. By July we were shadows. Minsk had fallen. We were behind enemy lines, scattered groups wandering through forests, chased like animals. Our boots disintegrated, our feet bled. Men wrapped them in rags, leaves, even pages from hymn books taken from ruined churches. I was captured on the 6th of July. A Soviet patrol surrounded us in the woods. We were too weak to fight. They stripped us of belts, watches, boots. They marched us barefoot to a collection point. Along the road lay the corpses of others who hadn't made it. Some were shot, others starved. The guards laughed when we fell, beat us with rifle butts until we staggered back up. In the camp I scrawled on a scrap of paper, "We thought we were an army. We are only bones now." Of the 78th Sturm Division, almost nothing remained. Tens of thousands were lost in the pocket. Some starved, some shot, some simply disappeared into the swamps. I was among the unlucky who lived, though sometimes I think the dead were luckier. Even now, I smell the marshes, the blood, the burning villages. I dream of the barrage that began it all, the earth shaking, the sky tearing, and the voice in my head whispering, "It is the end." Friedrich Amler was 30 years old, a lieutenant in the 1st Battalion of the 97th Jaeger Division. In late August 1944, after the Soviet summer offensives ripped open the front in Ukraine and Romania collapsed, his division was thrown into a chaotic retreat across the Carpathian passes. Cut off, starved, and relentlessly hunted by Soviet armor and partisans, Friedrich's diary survived, even though he did not. They told us we were moving into defensive positions, but the truth was we were already beaten. When Romania collapsed at the end of August, the whole southern front split open like a wound. Soviet tanks poured in from every direction. The sky was filled with their aircraft, the roads clogged with burning wreckage. Orders stopped making sense. They told us to hold the line, but there was no line left to hold. We fled west into the Carpathians. The mountains looked like salvation. Tall ridges, deep forests, narrow passes where maybe we could stop them, but the mountains became a trap. The roads were jammed with retreating columns, infantry, wagons, broken tanks, horse carts filled with wounded, refugees carrying everything they owned in bundles on their backs. The dust choked us by day. The cold froze us by night. Soviet aircraft circled like hawks. Yak fighters and Sturmovik swooped down in waves, their machine guns raking the roads, their rockets blasting carts into splinters. Horses screamed, men burned alive in their own wagons. We dived into ditches, praying. Food vanished within days. The supply columns had been overrun. We survived on whatever we could find. Half-rotten potatoes dug from abandoned fields, apples from orchards stripped bare, a horse shot and butchered by candlelight. We ate it raw because there was no time to cook. The meat made us vomit, but we kept chewing. Hunger left no choice. Everywhere was mud. The rains came early, turning mountain tracks into swamps. Boots sucked under, wheels snapped, carts overturned. Wounded men were left behind in the mud, begging us not to leave them. I still hear their voices. We told ourselves we had no choice, but the guilt never left. Partisans haunted the forests. At night we heard their whistles, saw their fires glowing on the ridges. They attacked the stragglers, slit throats, cut telephone wires, set ambushes with grenades. One morning we found an entire platoon hanging from trees, their faces black, tongues swollen, boots gone. We moved on in silence. The Soviets were everywhere. They moved faster than we thought possible, their tanks grinding up narrow roads we swore were impassable. They cut across valleys, blocked bridges, smashed through villages. We tried to hold them with Panzerfausts, but ammunition was almost gone. Once we ambushed a T-34 in a ravine. We fired point blank, and it burst into flames, the crew screaming as they tried to crawl out. But for every one we killed, 5 more came. By October, the division had ceased to exist. Companies were reduced to squads, battalions to handfuls. We were no longer organized, just bands of starving men stumbling west. The wounded dragged themselves on sticks. Many shot themselves rather than be captured. Some deserted into the mountains. Others simply lay down in the mud and closed their eyes. I remember one night in the high passes. Snow had begun to fall. We had no tents, no blankets, only thin coats. We huddled together like animals, but the cold cut through. In the morning 3 men were frozen stiff, their eyes glazed, snow covering their faces like masks. We stripped their clothes and moved on. Disease spread with the hunger, dysentery, typhus, pneumonia. Men coughed blood, shat themselves to death, collapsed in the mud. The stench of sickness hung over every bivouac. The medics had no medicine, no bandages, no hope. They just shook their heads. In the villages, we saw what war had done. Burned houses, looted barns, old women digging for potatoes in frozen earth. They looked at us with hatred. Some spat at us, others begged for bread. We had none to give. Children with swollen bellies followed us, silent, staring. The Soviets caught us in a valley near Uzhhorod, tanks from the front, cavalry from the flanks, aircraft above. We were trapped. Our commander told us to break out in small groups. It was chaos. Men ran in every direction, through forests, up hillsides, across streams. Machine gun fire cut them down. Mortar shells burst in the trees, showering us with splinters. I ran until my lungs burned. I hid in a barn with 5 others. For 3 days we lay among hay and manure, eating rats we trapped with our bare hands. On the 4th day, partisans found us. They dragged us out, beat us with rifle butts, stripped us of boots and coats. One of us tried to run. They shot him in the back. They left his body in the mud. I was marched barefoot for days to a Soviet camp. Along the road lay the dead, men shot for falling behind, men who hanged themselves from trees, men who drowned in the rivers trying to escape. I thought I would join them, but somehow I kept walking. At the camp, the gates closed behind us, barbed wire, guard towers, searchlights. I knew I would never see Germany again. I wrote my last words on a scrap of paper hidden in my boot. We thought the mountains would save us. Instead, they buried us. There is no honor left here, only hunger, cold, and death. Forgive me. I never left the Carpathians. My bones are still there, under snow and forest. Karl Brenner was 25 years old, a Rottenführer, corporal in the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf. After surviving the retreats from Ukraine, his unit was thrown into Hungary to stem the Soviet advance toward Budapest. From the plains near Debrecen to the ruins of villages along the Tisa River, Karl lived through weeks of ceaseless fighting, encirclement, and desperate retreat. His words, recorded after his capture the collapse of an army forced into the last defensive battles on Hungarian soil. Hungary was meant to be different. The officers told us it was fertile land, full of bread and cattle, where we could regroup and fight on stronger ground. But when I crossed the border in October, all I saw was dust, smoke, and fire. The Soviets had already arrived. We were ordered to hold the Great Hungarian Plain, near Debrecen. They called it the gateway to Budapest. If we lost it, the road to the capital would be wide open. Our division was thrown in alongside Viking and fragments of Hungarian troops. But it wasn't a battle, it was a storm. The Soviets came with tanks, columns of T-34s, Shermans from America, monstrous IS-2s, with guns that tore through our panzers like paper. Their infantry followed in waves, riding trucks, clinging to tanks, flooding the fields as far as the eye could see. Our artillery fired until the barrels split. We laid mines, ambushed with Panzerfausts, prayed for air support, but their planes owned the skies. Il-Second Sturmovik circled overhead like vultures, their rockets tearing holes in our lines, their machine guns ripping men to pieces in open fields. We dug into shallow trenches in the black earth. The soil clung to us like tar. At night, the horizon glowed red from burning villages. Cattle lay in fields bloated, their stomachs torn open by shrapnel. The smell was unbearable. Rot, manure, human flesh. For days we held on by instinct. A farmhouse became a fortress. A ditch became a graveyard. One night they broke through with tanks. We fired Panzerfausts at 20 meters, so close the explosions blinded us. I saw comrades burned alive inside their own half-tracks, screaming as flames poured out the hatches. A boy from Hamburg threw himself under a T-34 with a grenade. The blast flipped the tracks, but left nothing of him. The Hungarians fought beside us, but they were shattered. Their horses collapsed in the mud, their weapons jammed, their officers frantic. Some deserted outright, others fought with wild courage, charging with sabres, but the Red Army cut them down with machine guns. By late October, we were retreating in fragments. Whole regiments were gone, swallowed in the steppe. We fought skirmishes in villages that changed hands 3 times in a day. Houses collapsed under shell fire, burying civilians and soldiers alike. I remember one woman screaming for her children under the rubble. No one stopped. Survival was all that mattered. We reached the Tisza River. The bridges were gone, blown up in panic. Men tried to swim across in full kit. The current took them. Their helmets bobbed downstream like tin bowls. We ferried across on doors, barrels, anything that floated. Machine gun fire raked the water. The river turned red. On the far bank, we regrouped with scraps of Totenkopf and Viking. Our officers said we would counterattack. We laughed bitterly. There was nothing left to attack with. Companies were down to a dozen men. Ammunition was counted bullet by bullet. Food was horse meat roasted over burning rafters. In November, the Soviets pushed again, harder than ever. They poured through the plains toward Budapest. We fought delaying actions, ambushes in forests, barricades in towns. Every day we fell back. Every day more men were lost. We lived like ghosts, moving at night, hiding by day, coughing from the smoke that never cleared. I remember one last stand in a ruined monastery near Szolnok. We barricaded the doors with pews, stacked rubble in the windows, set up MG-42s on the altar. The icons stared down at us as we fired into the advancing Soviets. Shells tore through the walls, stained glass shattered in a storm of colour and dust. The roof collapsed, crushing half our platoon. We pulled bodies out with bare hands, then fought on among the corpses. By nightfall, we were out of ammunition. We slipped away through the marshes, leaving the dead behind. When we reached the outskirts of Budapest in December, we were no longer soldiers. We were scarecrows in rags, lice-ridden, hollow-eyed, dragging rusted weapons we could barely lift. The city loomed ahead, a fortress of stone and steel where, we were told, we would make our stand. None of us believed we would leave it alive. I wrote in my notebook, "Hungary is not the breadbasket they promised. It is a slaughterhouse. The plains drink blood like water. We are only bones now, marching into the grave." I was captured in the siege of Budapest 2 months later. The Soviets found me in a cellar, too weak to move, my hands raw, my boots long gone. They asked me why we kept fighting. I had no answer. This is the true story of Mintauts Blosfelds, a Latvian soldier who endured the brutal collapse of the Eastern Front, fought alongside German forces against the Red Army, and made a harrowing retreat from the ruins of Russia back toward his homeland. From frostbitten trenches to burning villages, from firefights in the forests of Estonia to his final escape aboard an overloaded ship out of Riga, Blosfelds witnessed the last desperate gasps of a war that was already lost. But this isn't just another war story. It's the voice of a man trapped between 2 empires, watching his country fall into Soviet hands, trying to survive with nothing left but instinct, grit, and the hope of one more sunrise. We were told to report to the company commander that morning. He gave us a short, tired nod, then waved us off with orders to rest before nightfall, before the retreat. I wasn't particularly tired, not yet, so I sat alone on my bunk, scribbled a quick letter home. Nothing dramatic, just words, as if pretending normal life still existed somewhere beyond the smoke and frost. But before I could drift off, the door of the bunker slammed open so violently it felt like an explosion. A runner stood in the doorway, pale as death, eyes wide. He shouted, "Stand to! Russian attack! Incoming!" His voice cracked under the weight of panic. For a second we were stunned, then we leapt into motion. Rifles, helmets, grenades. The sound outside confirmed everything. Distant but ferocious shelling, not right on us, but close, too close. Judging by the pounding, it was the trenches just north of our position getting hammered, the right flank of the 33rd Regiment. The ground shook with each impact, a constant stomach-churning rumble. Our own mortars were silent, gone. The artillery had pulled out hours ago. We were being left to face this with whatever we had on our backs. We crouched in the tree line, straining to understand the tempo of the barrage. For half an hour the shelling didn't let up. Then it shifted. You could feel the change. Less distant, more focused. The infantry were coming, we could hear it. Faint Russian shouting carried on the wind, like ghosts in the smoke. Somewhere behind me, our company commander was barking into the telephone. I'll never forget his voice, tight, frantic, but still forceful. "Whatever you do, don't let them break through the gap between the lakes. If they do, everything's lost." I didn't know if he was speaking to the 33rd Regiment or our outpost on the far left, a strong point ahead of our trench line with machine guns positioned directly over that narrow passage between the lakes. If he was calling them, it was already too late. A runner came stumbling back from that strong point. His face was white as ash. His hands trembled uncontrollably. He opened his mouth to report, but before he could speak, the flare gun on his belt accidentally fired. The flare shot downward, straight into his boot, and he collapsed, screaming. We tore the leather away from his leg, seared black with fresh burns, and hastily wrapped it. He limped off toward the rear, still shaking. His words had been simple. "They're through." The Russians had broken through the line held by the 33rd after an absolutely merciless bombardment. Their trenches had caved in. Anti-tank guns had zeroed in on our strong point, pinning down our machine gunners so tightly they couldn't lift their heads without taking a bullet. The men were either buried or bleeding. No one dared return fire. We waited. Soon their guns shifted. Our position became the target. Shells came screaming through the air, exploding in the birchwoods around us. Trees were split open like matchsticks. Splinters the size of daggers sliced through the air. Earth exploded skyward. It felt like the entire forest was under siege. The air itself shook. I looked down at the trench wall and saw my own hands gripping the rifle so tight my knuckles had turned white. Still, we waited. We clutched our grenades. We checked the safety on our rifles. We listened for the sound of boots in the underbrush. But the attack never came. Not yet. Instead, we were given the signal. It was time to move. Time to leave this death trap behind. The company commander emerged from his bunker, his face grey with exhaustion, but still sharp. He told us we'd be the last to leave. Rear guard. We would hold the line just long enough for the rest of the company to melt into the forest and disappear. We nodded. No complaints. It was what we were there for. We followed the edge of the lake and passed a group of legionnaires manhandling a heavy anti-tank gun, dragging it through the woods by sheer will. No horses, no trucks, just sweat and desperation. As we crested a hill, we caught sight of the company, the entire column, moving below us in open fields. From our elevated position, we could see another column off in the distance, descending from the hills behind our old front. But the distance was too great. We couldn't tell if they were ours or Russian. The heat was unbearable. The air was thick, and the weight of our packs pressed down like iron. My shirt was soaked through. I could feel sweat trickling down my spine as we marched across the sun-baked clearing. Every footstep felt like it echoed, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, gunfire. It started with a crack. Then a barrage of rifle shots and bursts from light machine guns. Tracers zipped overhead, red and green streaks slicing through the sky. The fire was coming from the woods to our right. For a moment, confusion set in. Men shouted. Some ducked. Others dropped prone. Then, our commander raised his hand and pointed toward the tree line. We didn't hesitate. The whole company turned and sprinted. Within seconds, we reached the edge of the forest. I threw myself down and swung my machine gun into position. My fingers found the trigger and let off a burst, sharp, instinctive, suppressive. But I couldn't see a damn thing. The birch trees were too thick, their white trunks blurring everything. I stopped firing. Others did the same. The forest went still. No return fire, no voices, just the low hum of tension. We held position. We waited. And then, slowly, we began to understand. Whoever had taken shots at us wasn't eager to continue. Maybe our charge had thrown them off. Maybe they were probing us. But for now, the danger passed. The attackers had clearly melted away, and with no time to sweep the forest for stragglers, we pulled back into the open field. Orders were barked, and we quickly reformed into rough platoon groups before pushing onward. The woods to our right gradually thinned out, and soon the company was descending into a shallow depression in the ground. Then, without warning, it happened. Gunfire ripped into us from the right flank, a sudden, ferocious burst of machine gun fire delivered at close range. It was devastatingly accurate, and the effect was immediate. Chaos exploded within our ranks. Shouts turned to screams. The company commander, trying to rally us and raise his arm for a counterattack, was hit and crumpled to the ground. In a matter of seconds, bodies littered the open field. Some men tried to run, others hit the dirt, but there was barely any cover, and the Russian machine gun didn't stop. By the time our group emerged from the tree line, we were met with a sight that turned the stomach. The depression was filled with fallen comrades, many dead, some writhing, crawling feebly toward the rye field beyond. A few of the wounded still moved, dragging themselves through the mud in a desperate attempt to reach safety. But the Russian fire picked them off one by one, their machine gun, clearly visible on a low rise just a couple 100 yards away, kept up its deadly rhythm. I could even make out figures near the weapon, Russians standing shouting for our men to surrender. They hadn't seen us yet. We were still in the birch's shadow. That tiny window of concealment might be our only chance. I dropped flat to the ground, steadied my machine gun, lined up the crew, and squeezed the trigger. Nothing. The weapon clicked but didn't fire. I yanked the bolt to eject the round. Jammed. I tried again, harder. Still jammed. I reached for the top cover to pry it open, but it wouldn't budge. The weapon was dead. I was helpless. All I had now were my legs. The Russians spotted us. Bullets snapped through the air, kicking up dirt all around. Then, just behind me, came the rattle of a machine pistol. My friend the corporal had opened fire to draw their attention. It worked. The volume of fire dipped slightly, giving us just enough time to move. I ran, or tried to. The thick, waterlogged marsh sucked at my boots with every step. My ski boots felt like anchors. The useless weight of the jammed gun dragged at my arms. The corporal caught up beside me, saw my struggle, and yelled, "Don't mess about! Ditch the bone saw and get into the rye." He'd fired all his rounds. We had no firepower left, and the Russians were ramping up again. Without hesitation, I hurled the machine gun as far as I could into the marshy water and bolted forward. Together, we reached the edge of the rye field. Russian rounds hissed through the stalks behind us, but we hit the ground and crawled fast and low, pushing forward with every ounce of strength left in us. At last, we crossed into the sheltering trees and vanished into the forest's cover. We regrouped near the tree line, just a handful of us now, the remains of the company. No one spoke. We tossed a few grenades blindly into the lakeside bushes to deter pursuit, then moved westward through the woods in silence, each man gripped by the same thought. Were we already surrounded? We didn't know, but we had almost no weapons left between us. I still had 2 grenades at my belt and one clenched tightly in my hand, ready to be thrown at the first sound of pursuit. After a long march through the forest, we reached a bridge spanning the river Velikaya, near what had once been the 32nd Regiment's headquarters. Now it was just smouldering ruins. Bunkers charred black, no sign of command, no officers, no maps, just 2 weary observers crouched in the undergrowth, keeping watch for the advancing enemy. We told them what had happened. They barely nodded. Then we moved on. The road west stretched long and empty. We walked all afternoon, boots dragging through the dust. By the time we reached the outskirts of Krasnoye, darkness had fallen and the village burned. Somewhere up ahead, a house lit the road in flickering orange light. Flames danced along a stone wall that ran alongside the road's left-hand side, a wall now riddled with bullet holes. The gunfire was still coming, somewhere from the right. The Russians had pushed this far already. To get through, we dropped into the ditches and crawled. Bullets cracked overhead like angry insects. Any vehicle brave enough to try had to race through the gauntlet at full speed. There was no safety here. Just beyond the village, we were stopped by an officer. Desperation lined his face. He begged us to check out a clump of trees roughly 500 yards to the right. He thought the enemy might be massing there. He promised fire support from a row of anti-aircraft guns he'd stationed on the road, already pointed north. But then he looked us over, our torn uniforms, the mud, the blood, the empty belts. We weren't soldiers anymore. We were escapees. He shook his head. "Go to the rear, boys," he said, his voice softer now. "But get yourselves some weapons. You'll need them." He didn't need to repeat himself. We barely made it 20 steps down the road when fresh artillery shells rained into the village behind us. Flames soared into the night sky. From the tree line he'd wanted us to inspect, we heard shouting, Russian voices. They were already there. A massive piece of shrapnel screamed overhead and slammed into the road ahead, throwing up a thick cloud of dust. We dropped instinctively, hearts pounding, then broke into a half-crouched run, trying to get as far away from the blast zone as fast as possible. And then we walked through the night, no words, just the steady shuffle of boots, the rustle of gear, and the echo of gunfire far behind us. The endless stretch of blackened forest we'd just passed through was said to be the Germans' doing, torched deliberately to deny the partisans cover near the main road. Now a dense haze of smoke hung over everything. The sight of those scorched trees, once proud and tall, now reduced to splintered husks, stirred an unsettling thought in many of us. One day, it might be our own homeland burning like this. We were exhausted. After marching through the night without sleep, all we wanted was a few hours of rest, believing we'd finally placed enough distance between ourselves and the advancing Russians. As the morning mist began to lift with the slow rise of the sun, we emerged from the woods and stepped out into open terrain. Visibility was excellent now. You could see for miles, and soon someone up ahead pointed out something strange in the distance, a tall wooden fire watch tower, easily a couple of miles away. It had a red flag fluttering at the top. A murmur rippled through the column. Had the Russians really pushed this far already? It didn't seem possible. A group of German soldiers stationed along the roadside assured us it was probably just partisans playing tricks, nothing more, and that the main Soviet forces were still further east. Whether they believed it or were just trying to keep everyone calm, we couldn't say. We continued on foot for another hour before finally being allowed to leave the road and rest on the grassy slope of a steep embankment. Off to our right, the countryside opened into vast flatlands, meadows and farmland stretching out beneath the glare of the sun. We scanned it anxiously for any sign of enemy movement, but all was quiet, serene even. The heat shimmered on the horizon in rising waves, and one by one the men started to doze off under the sun's weight. That calm didn't last long. The low hum of approaching aircraft stirred the sleepers and brought everyone to alert. We stood, shielding our eyes, straining to pinpoint their direction. Then we saw them, 3 planes coming in fast and low from the direction of the burnt-out forest behind us. They flew with the sun at their backs, making identification difficult. Russian or German, no one knew. Just to be safe, we dove into the roadside ditches and waited. Only when they passed overhead, close enough for us to see the pilots' faces in their cockpits, did we spot the red stars on the wings. Soviet reconnaissance aircraft, flying so low they might have touched the treetops, but they didn't fire. No bombs, no strafing, just a pass, then they climbed sharply and disappeared to the east. Not long after, word came we were moving again, but thankfully not far. We crossed a line of freshly dug trenches before being split into smaller squads and shown the section of the new front line we were to hold. The position was strong. The trenches ran along low ridges with forward strong points carved into the approach. All vegetation in front had been cleared, trees felled, bushes uprooted, leaving only ankle-high stumps tangled with barbed wire. What impressed us most were the bunkers, real ones, deep underground with dual entrances, reinforced overhead with crossed timber beams in thick layers. They'd been expertly camouflaged. Unless you knew exactly where to look, you'd never guess a single one was there. Whoever had built this line had taken their time, and it was clear the intention was to stand firm here. But that would take manpower, and we were painfully short. After days of retreat, each company had maybe 20 men left, and most had little more than rifles and helmets. The commanders worked with what they had, shuffling men into positions and plugging gaps. Some were sent to dig fresh communication trenches from bunkers to the machine gun nests. I was assigned elsewhere, with a group of fellow legionnaires. Our task was to secure the rear. Roughly a mile behind our line stood a small village. We were to clear it, simple on paper, but we knew even the quietest-looking cluster of homes could be crawling with partisans. We approached carefully, watching for movement, listening for the telltale rustle of boots or whispered Russian voices. But nothing stirred. We bolted across the fields and reached the first house. One man kicked open the door while the rest of us covered him from behind with rifles raised. Empty. The next house, also deserted. But eventually we found them, about 10 civilians huddled together in one small room, silent and terrified. We posted a guard and swept the rest of the village, but no one else turned up. One of the legionnaires who spoke Russian ordered the group to leave at once and head toward Opochka. They refused. They insisted they'd only just fled here from the Russians and wanted to rest for a day or two before continuing their journey. The men in particular grew agitated, defiant even, but there was no time to argue. We made our point clearer. Weapons drawn. That changed their minds. They packed their things quickly and trudged across the fields, casting angry looks back at us as they went. With the village now cleared, we began looking for anything useful. Chickens clucked and scratched near one of the cottages, but they were too quick, darting under floorboards before anyone could grab them. A few legionnaires had better luck spotting a pig in the field. They shot it cleanly and dragged the body back toward the trenches, cheering as they went. Someone found a large metal cauldron to cook it in, and spirits soared. Back at the line, I changed into my swimming trunks and joined the men digging the trench. Others were butchering the pig nearby, laughing and elbow-deep in fat and blood. For a brief moment, it felt like the war had paused. But then came the sound we all feared. A pair of shells slammed into no man's land, tall fountains of dirt and smoke erupting with a sharp crack. At first, we thought it might be our own artillery ranging the field, but the next shell landed much closer. Then another. It was clear now. This was Russian. We dropped our tools and sprinted for the bunker, diving for cover along the way as a Soviet plane swooped overhead, machine guns rattling. We dressed fast, buckled on our gear, and climbed back into the trench, rifles reloaded and hands steady. The sound of gunfire to our left was growing louder. Through the distant haze, we heard shouting, the harsh clack of machine pistols, and, unmistakably, tank tracks grinding along the road near a village about a mile north. A line of legionnaires emerged from the village, retreating under fire, taking cover in ditches and returning fire toward the houses. A Soviet tank rumbled after them, barreling straight down the tree-lined road swinging south toward our rear. Now we were facing disaster. Artillery still pounded our front, but the Russians were circling behind. We were about to be flanked and attacked from both sides. The CO hesitated. We were too few to hold, but no orders had come from above. All communications were down, no link to the regiment, no orders from division, just a thin line of men, boxed in and running out of time. We waited for nearly 15 minutes, watching the battle play out up the road. Then it happened. The legionnaires broke and fled their position. Behind them came a wall of Soviets, two groups, one chasing them southward and the other advancing directly on us. The decision was made. There was no time for speeches. We abandoned the trenches, climbed out, and slipped away into the dead ground behind the hills, running full tilt toward another village further west. The sun was scorching now. Our uniforms were soaked in sweat, mouths dry as ash. We came upon a small, peaceful lake, its surface like glass, untouched. Without hesitation, every man stopped to drink. Not a word was said. The village sat on a low hill, and from its edge we could see the Russians moving in behind us, a long, unwavering line. But now we had the advantage. Good elevation, clear fields of fire. We set up along the fence at the edge of the village and waited. When they entered range, we opened up. They were clear targets, moving across ploughed fields with barely any cover. They dropped one by one, some rolling, others simply folding and disappearing into the dirt. We shouted to each other through the gunfire, just like the rifle range. But the return fire came soon after. The rest had taken cover in ditches, and now their bullets zipped past us. They were facing directly into the afternoon sun, blinded by the glare, while we remained in the village's long shadow. It was far from over, but for the first time in days, we were no longer running. The shadows cast by the village trees gave us some comfort, but our attention stayed fixed on the left flank. The Russians had still been pressing from that direction, until the familiar rattle of German machine guns suddenly filled the air. We heard it clearly from the tree line, and with it came a flicker of relief. We weren't alone, but that brief calm was shattered again. Soon after, rifle fire crackled behind us, then machine guns, and not a few scattered shots, sustained bursts. Our hearts sank. If the Russians were now behind us as well, then we were encircled. We'd have nowhere left to run. I called for 2 men, and we moved quickly, crouched low, weaving between the rear houses of the village to scout what was happening. As we edged around the last row of buildings, we saw the truth. A full company, maybe more, of legionnaires advancing across the fields in a firing line, and they were shooting directly into the village, at us. Their gunners had clearly mistaken us for the enemy. Bullets struck the walls around us again and again in a steady rhythm. We couldn't stick our heads out, let alone make ourselves seen. It was obvious. They believed the Russians had already taken the village. Acting quickly, someone tied a white handkerchief to the tip of a bayonet and waved it around a corner. I did the same with my helmet, holding it out just far enough to be noticed. At last, the gunfire stopped. We rose from cover, arms waving, shouting, desperate to make ourselves known. Just in time, the legionnaires were barely 100 yards away, weapons raised, preparing to storm the village. They lowered their rifles. Instantly, we were swarmed with questions. 2 officers arrived soon after, and I reported the situation as clearly and quickly as I could. Within moments, the new troops moved up and blended into our line, reinforcing the defence. In my short absence, something had happened. My friend, the corporal, was gone. I asked around and was told he'd been hit and carried to the centre of the village. I found him inside a small house, lying pale and still on a crude bed of blankets. He'd taken a bullet through the side. His face was drained of colour, lips dry, hands trembling. "Don't leave me to the Russians," he kept saying over and over, barely louder than a whisper. "You won't be," I promised. I would get him out. I ran back to the edge of the village and pulled 3 men from the line. We fashioned a stretcher using rifles and ground sheets and lifted him carefully. He was a big man. Carrying him was slow, painful work. Our arms ached, shoulders burned, sweat poured down our backs. Every 100 yards we had to stop for breath, but we didn't stop for long. Eventually, we reached the next village, where the temporary headquarters of the Latvian Legion had been set up. There was a doctor, but no vehicle, no ambulance. High-ranking officers clustered in small groups, watching the front line through binoculars on tripods. Camouflaged anti-tank guns were hidden in the orchards and hedgerows, their barrels trained toward the east. We laid the corporal down gently. When we lifted him off the stretcher, we saw the ground sheet soaked red beneath him. I sent the others back to the front and stayed beside him. In the chaos of headquarters, no one noticed or questioned me. I wasn't leaving my friend. Half an hour later, an ammunition wagon was heading to the rear. They allowed him on board, and I climbed up with him. We rode together until we reached a casualty station a few miles away. There we parted. He didn't say much, just reached out and gripped my hand. His face was still grey, lips tight with pain, but his eyes said enough. I turned back alone. By the time I returned to headquarters, darkness had fallen. A battery of our field guns had taken up position near the road, hidden in dense brush. Their barrels flashed in the gloom, belching thick smoke that clung to the trees like a ghostly mist. Nearby, our anti-aircraft guns were firing, long arcs of tracer cutting through the dark between villages, aimed at Russian positions that still hadn't broken through. I couldn't bring myself to return to the front that night. I was dead on my feet. 3 days of retreat, fighting, carrying the wounded, no sleep. I'd heard that our supply unit was billeted a few miles further back, so I headed that way. The commander of the supply unit had known me back in the guards company. When I arrived, he greeted me warmly. "You look like hell," he said. "Stay, I've got work for you." He explained they'd been hit by Russian aircraft the day before and would be relocating in the morning. One of his drivers had been wounded. I could take his place. At first, I hesitated. I didn't want to abandon my unit, but he waved my concern away. "Don't be stupid," he said. "You've earned a breather." He was right. I was torn, but the exhaustion won. I stayed, at least for the night. We fed the horses, shared a quick supper, and curled up inside the wagons with nothing but horse blankets to cover us. The front was quieter now, though Russian aircraft still buzzed overhead from time to time. They didn't bomb us directly, focusing their attacks on the supply roads further behind. We watched their flares drift down slowly, lighting up the black horizon like falling stars. We'd survived the day, but none of us believed that peace would last. When I rejoined the supply unit of our company, only 2 wagons remained out of the 10 or 12 we'd started with. The rest had been lost, abandoned, or destroyed along the chaotic route. The surviving men were slumped in the bushes, catching what rest they could after yet another long, exhausting night on the move. Orders hadn't yet come, so we waited. As evening fell, the warm air hung still around us as we set off again, this time heading south. The wagons were overloaded, piled high with whatever supplies had been salvaged, the most essential remnants of our company's gear. None of the drivers rode on the carts. They walked beside them in silence, each leading his team of horses, and one cart pulled along a spare horse. It had taken shrapnel during a recent air raid, but was still on its feet, though limping. We reached Stiglova and had to wait near a small church for our turn to continue down the road. While we rested in the dusk, someone pointed upward. A strange light appeared in the sky, like a lone star moving slowly toward us from the south. It followed no straight path, wavering as it moved, and there was no sound, no engine, no hum. It didn't behave like any aircraft we knew, especially since no wartime plane would fly with visible navigation lights. What it was remains a mystery to this day. By morning, we crossed the Rezekne highway near Berzgal and continued on through Ragauka, Driseni, then turned north again. We expected to skirt around the northern end of Lake Lubanas and pass through Bikava, but instead of continuing north, the route curved south once more. Eventually, we arrived at the southern tip of the lake and turned west toward Varaklani. By this point, we had been on the road for days. Sleep came in brief intervals, stolen beside roadside ditches. The wounded horse hadn't improved, still limping, its strength clearly fading. It needed rest, not more endless marching. Near Varaklani, we traded the poor creature to a local farmer in exchange for 2 bottles of vodka. Most of our journey took us along narrow country roads. The main highways were clogged with Latgalian civilians, long lines of carts and people fleeing the Russian advance. Those who stayed behind were either too old or too loyal to the Soviets to flee. Russian aircraft attacked the main roads frequently, strafing and bombing refugees. Many died where they stood, their carts overturned, horses shredded by gunfire. On the smaller roads, we were relatively safe, but even there, the eastern sky echoed with the constant growl of artillery. The front was never far behind. From Varaklani, we took the road toward Madona, but before reaching the town, we turned north again and made for Lubana. There, in a quiet wooded area, we halted for an entire day. It was a rare moment of peace. We slept outdoors under the wagons, and thanks to the supplies we still carried, we had more than enough food and drink. The surrounding landscape, with Lake Lubana and its swamps to our east, and the river Ivikste behind us, formed a natural defensive cradle. It gave us a sense, however fleeting, that we were out of reach for the moment. We pressed on, passing through a dense forest, hugging the northern edge of the impassable swamp, and emerged in the more open country of Vidzeme, central Latvia. The trees on either side of the road had been wired with explosive charges, likely rigged to collapse across the path when the Russians came. The enemy was expected here. Along the roadside we saw 2 graves, simple wooden crosses rising from the grass, a German helmet placed on each one. The partisans had left their mark, even here. The next few days passed in steady, slow travel across Vidzeme. No one truly knew where we were headed. That changed at the end of July, when a new order came down. Only 1 man was to remain with each cart. The rest of us were to dismount and form up at the roadside. Platoons were organized, weapons redistributed, and we began marching south once more. Our progress was steady. We passed through Lobert and eventually arrived in Koknese one warm afternoon. There we halted, lined up, and about 50 names were read aloud. We, the chosen few, all legionnaires from our regiment, were told to wait for German army transport. As we waited in the shade, I wandered into a nearby orchard. Blackcurrant bushes lined the edges, their fruit hanging heavy and ripe. I picked handfuls, devouring them until my fingers were stained and my stomach finally felt full. For a fleeting moment, I felt human again. When the trucks arrived, we climbed aboard and drove for around 3 hours. By the end of the journey, we reached divisional headquarters, situated roughly 20 miles from Riga. That night, we slept in a barn, thick with hay and the faint smell of livestock. It was quiet, warm, safe. During the evening roll call, the officer stepped forward and began to read off the names of men who would receive the Iron Cross the following morning. My name was among them. I was stunned. I hadn't known anything about a recommendation. It turned out that one of our officers had put me forward for my attempt to destroy the Russian machine gun back on July 10th during the ambush. I hadn't succeeded. The gun jammed, but apparently the effort had not gone unnoticed. Morning came quickly. After breakfast, we cleaned ourselves up, brushed the dust from our uniforms, and lined up for the ceremony in a clearing beside the forest. The divisional commander inspected the men, then called forward those who had been awarded the medal. There were about 20 of us. He walked down the line, one by one, pinning the Iron Cross to each man's buttonhole and shaking our hands. When he reached me, he nodded with something close to pride. I didn't know what to say. Soon after, we boarded trucks and made for Riga. The city welcomed us as if we had returned from a great victory. Crowds lined the streets. Civilians waved and threw packets of cigarettes into the beds of the trucks. Young women stepped forward with flowers, tucking them into our belts or buttonholes. To them, we were heroes, defenders of the capital. They didn't know the truth, that Jelgava had already fallen days ago in a surprise tank assault. The Russians had reached the Baltic coast and split Latvia in two, but in that moment, in their eyes, we were the front line, and among us, the newly decorated stood out. The Iron Cross, worn traditionally on the buttonhole for the first 24 hours, drew attention. I felt their eyes on me, not with fear or sadness, but with admiration. The parade ended at a delousing station. We were scrubbed down, issued clean uniforms, and sent to the artillery barracks. This was now the base of our new formation, Battle Group Jekyll, hand-picked men from both Latvian divisions, placed under the direct command of General Jekyll himself. The next day, we were fully re-equipped. New Panzer Grenadier uniforms, high-quality arms, ammunition. We trained and ate with a nearby German unit and were even permitted brief leave in the evenings. But the discipline was strict. We drilled hard, jumping from trucks, forming up on the road, engaging in simulated combat. Our weapons were unfamiliar but effective. British-designed Bren light machine guns, Czech submachine guns, and rifle-mounted grenade launchers. The officers leading us were hardened veterans, survivors of years on the Eastern Front. They pushed us hard. After a week, things relaxed slightly. In the field, when the officers weren't watching, we lounged beneath trees or rested quietly, waiting for the trucks to bring us home. Then, the announcement came. On the morning of August 11th, we left the artillery barracks for training as usual. But by 10 a.m. we were recalled and told to prepare for immediate deployment in full battle gear. There was no time to waste. Ammunition was handed out, gear checked, and by midday we rolled out of Riga, heading north. We drove through the afternoon and halted near the Estonian border, resting in a patch of woodland until nightfall. That evening, General Jekyll himself arrived. His small Fieseler Storch plane landing nearby, he inspected the assembled troops and addressed us directly. The Russians had broken through in the north. Their armoured spearhead was now cutting across Estonia toward the coast. Our mission was simple: delay them, hold them back long enough for heavier German formations to arrive and stabilise the front. Later that night, more units joined us: German military police, an anti-tank company, and supply detachments. We were issued rations for the next day and prepared to move again. After dark, we loaded into trucks once more and headed deeper into Estonia. Enemy aircraft struck during the night. They missed us, but bombed the road ahead, destroying supply vehicles and setting buildings ablaze. We dismounted and took cover, waiting for the skies to clear. By morning, the countryside was beautiful. Rolling green hills bathed in soft sun. But by mid-morning, a heavy fog descended, slowing our advance. When we reached our assigned position, we dismounted. All was quiet. There was no sign of the Russians, but the villagers knew they were close. The Estonians were packing their carts, women sobbing quietly as they prepared to abandon their homes. None of them wanted to stay under Soviet rule. Our officers gave us a rough defensive line. I split my platoon into 3 groups and posted them about 400 yards apart in the thick brush. Then we waited. The rifle grenades didn't fit properly on our launchers. While we waited in silence, I used a knife to shave the plastic down until they would sit correctly. We didn't expect to hold. The plan was to strike in ambush, then pull back before the tanks arrived. By midday, new orders arrived. The Russian column had shifted direction. We were to move again, to cut them off. Half an hour later, we arrived at the new position, and this time, as we stepped out into the fields and moved toward a low ridge, we could hear the battle ahead. It was close now. To our left, the German military police company spread out quickly into position. We Latvians held the centre, and the anti-tank gun crews set up on the right. Their guns were hauled straight up the hill without pause and began firing almost immediately. At first it seemed hasty, even reckless, but as we reached the hilltop and peered across the rolling landscape beyond, it all made sense. The land below was crawling with Soviet armour and trucks, tanks idling in formation, supply vehicles bunched up on narrow dirt roads, crews standing around. We'd caught them off guard. The Red Army had no idea we were here. Then came the Stukas. From high above, the familiar shriek of dive bombers pierced the sky, followed by devastating bursts of anti-tank fire, bombs dropping into clustered convoys, and strafing runs that scattered Soviet infantry like dust. The chaos unfolded beneath us, trucks torn apart, tanks immobilized, entire formations thrown into disarray. We watched the slaughter unfold like spectators from a theatre balcony. But it didn't last. Once the Stukas peeled away to refuel, the Soviets recovered fast. Their guns found the positions of our anti-tank batteries first and began methodically knocking them out. One by one, those brave gun crews were silenced, their weapons shattered. Now the spotlight shifted. It was our turn. Tank shells began raining down on our hills. Fast, brutal, and without warning. We hadn't had time to dig in, and now we were paying the price. Men dove for cover behind rocks, under carts, into natural folds of the terrain. The explosions were deafening. Shrapnel tore through the air. We lost several good men in those opening minutes, and yet we held. When the tanks finally moved forward to finish us, the German MPs fired back with handheld anti-tank rockets. 2 enemy tanks were hit and left burning in the open, their crews shot as they tried to escape the inferno. More burning wrecks dotted the countryside, courtesy of the Stukas. Thick black smoke columns rose into the sky, hanging motionless in the still afternoon air. The Russians shifted tactics. Their tanks stayed back while the infantry pressed forward, but they were met by our concealed machine guns. Whole lines of Soviet troops were cut down before they could reach us. The survivors faltered, then turned to flee. Behind them, political officers screamed orders, fired wildly with pistols, even shooting their own men in the back to force them forward. It didn't work. The enemy buckled, retreated, and eventually changed course altogether, deciding to bypass us entirely. We had held them, a small, battered force, and now they moved around our left flank, seeking easier ground. In the thick of that barrage, a fragment of metal caught me. A shell burst nearby, and I didn't feel it at first, but then the throb came. My left cheek had been torn open by a shard. It went straight through, took out half a tooth, and left my tongue gashed. The pain caught up to me quickly. My eye was nearly swollen shut. Blood ran into my collar. The company medic examined me where I sat. He wrapped my wound and tied a wounded tag to my tunic, marking me for evacuation. As the battle group began pulling back, our transport arrived, but I still had to walk to the casualty station. Crossing the fields, I watched enemy machine gun fire ripple through the corn, cutting it down in deadly straight lines. Rockets from Soviet launchers screamed overhead, pounding the retreating line with salvo after salvo. After a mile of trudging through the smoke and thunder, I reached an Estonian village where a temporary aid post had been set up. There was no transport yet, so I waited. Shells began falling nearby. Enemy tanks pushed forward through the woods and opened fire on the village. I dove into a ditch alongside a dozen German officers already huddled there. Even they were caught off guard. It might have been comical if it weren't so deadly. Houses burned, shrapnel hissed through the air, and every man kept his head down. Luckily, the tanks never advanced into the village itself. They fired a few rounds, then pulled back, leaving scorched buildings behind them. While I waited, a unit of Russian SS troops passed through the village, heading toward the front. They were volunteers, technically comrades, and we were told they were trustworthy. But we watched them with suspicion, and rightly so. Later I heard they'd turned on their officers, shot them, and defected to the enemy. Eventually, transport for the wounded arrived, and I was loaded aboard. We began the journey south, back toward Latvia. Along the way, we passed long convoys of German tanks, trucks, and infantry, part of the WWII SS division and other reserve formations, all moving to reinforce the collapsing front in Estonia. I was dropped off at Smiltene, where the military hospital was already overflowing. I spent a few days there recovering. My face began to heal, though the ache never quite faded. After a few days, more wounded arrived, and I was given my orders, returned to duty. No one knew exactly where Battle Group Jekyll was stationed. My papers instructed me to report to the artillery barracks in Riga, where the unit's headquarters staff was still located. I boarded a narrow-gauge train from Smiltene to Valmiera, then found an empty goods wagon and fell asleep on a bed of straw. When I woke, the train had stopped at Cesis. I opened the sliding door and spotted two young recruits walking along the platform. They asked to join me, and I welcomed them aboard. They had food, a full ham, several bottles of drink, and we made a night of it, sitting cross-legged around a suitcase with a candle on top, eating, talking, laughing, as if the war were miles away. The train rolled slowly through Riga the next morning, not stopping at the main station, but continuing on across the bridges before finally halting at Tornakalns. That worked perfectly for me. I'd removed the plaster from my cheek and didn't look wounded anymore. Without drawing attention, I slipped away and went to find my mother at her workplace to retrieve the keys to our flat. I spent a few precious days at home, cleaning my uniform and rifle, resting, eating properly. My posting orders had technically expired, but I knew I'd have to report back soon. At the barracks, only a few were left, the company clerk and a couple of others. No one knew where the unit had gone. Until orders came, I was assigned to guard the property and personal gear the men had left behind. That was on August 17th. I remained in Riga for 3 weeks. Despite the war, I could go home when I pleased. It was an odd luxury. Officially, all leave had been cancelled, but the front was shifting so fast that chaos had loosened the rules. Russian aircraft flew over Riga daily, but our anti-aircraft defences kept most of them at bay. Refugees poured into the city. Many were already leaving Latvia altogether, heading for Germany by train or ship. Then, in early September, the sergeant major returned from the front. He was here to gather any men still in the city and bring us back. He told us the company had been in hard fighting near Ape after leaving Vero. They had managed to hold the line against repeated Soviet assaults and were now attached to the 19th Latvian SS Division, operating somewhere in central Latvia. We prepared to move out. I took a few hours of leave to say goodbye to my mother. She wasn't home. I waited briefly, then left a note, ate a few slices of bread and jam, and walked out, not realizing it would be the last time I'd ever see that home. That evening, we boarded the train and travelled for a few hours to Yeriki, where we were supposed to change trains. We slept in the waiting room that night, only to discover the next morning that our train had left without us. No one seemed to mind. We passed the day drinking, playing cards, even coaxed 2 women to join us. That evening, someone found more drink, and by nightfall, we were deep into it. We missed the next train as well. Eventually, the station master had enough. He summoned the military police, who stopped the next passing train and threw us aboard. It was nothing but open flatbed cars, so we shivered in the wind the entire way. Another group of soldiers were riding further up, huddled around a milk churn filled with home-distilled vodka. One of them, drunk and trying to stay warm, began running back and forth across the cars, leaping over the couplings. He slipped, fell between 2 wagons. The train screeched to a halt. We gathered his broken body and wrapped it in a ground sheet. Then we rolled on in silence. Later, the sergeant major realized he had left his briefcase, full of documents, back in Yeriki. He couldn't face returning to the unit without it. I was the only one who spoke fluent German, so I was chosen to retrieve it. He wrote me fresh orders, and I took the next train back. This one was better. I rode in a horse wagon, lying in straw, and slept most of the way. I recovered the briefcase and rejoined the others the following evening. We spent one more night sleeping in a barn. Then, finally, we rejoined the front line. The journey had taken 5 days to cover barely 100 miles. It felt surreal. I was assigned to the reserve section, quartered in a farmhouse cellar about half a mile behind the trenches. From there, we could see the entire line stretching across the low hills, offering a clear view of Soviet movements. The front in that sector was relatively quiet. The Russians shelled us now and then with mortars and sent patrols into no man's land by night, but nothing serious. At night, aircraft buzzed overhead, bombing our supply routes, dodging the flak. One evening, we captured a Soviet pilot who'd been shot down. He tried to sneak back to his lines, but was caught in daylight. He trembled as we brought him in, convinced we'd shoot him on sight. When he saw our SS insignia, he nearly collapsed, but we gave him a cigarette, a drink, and within minutes he was talking, bitterly complaining about how the Red Army treated its own men. The next night, we received orders to move into no man's land and observe. We set out in silence, crossed our own lines, and made our way toward the charred ruins of a farmhouse. We paused just outside, lying in the frozen grass, listening for nearly an hour, not a sound. Eventually, the commander gave the signal. We stood, stretched our stiff limbs, and entered the ruins, rifles raised. The house had burned to its foundations, the floor collapsed into the cellar. 2 men stayed outside to keep watch, while the rest of us slipped into the cold black hole beneath the earth, huddling for warmth. And so we waited for morning. The night passed without any incidents, and as the sun rose, the 2 sentries were withdrawn into the cellar as they were too exposed, and we could, in any case, see everything we needed through the small windows of the cellar. Around breakfast time, our artillery started firing ranging rounds along the Russian front line. The shells crept nearer and nearer to us until we expected the next salvo to fall right on top of the farm. It would have been impossible to move out of the cellar and seek better cover, and we had to rely on our good luck. When the shells arrived and exploded on the ruins, we were showered with bricks and rubble, but did not suffer any casualties. We didn't like being fired on by our own guns, but on the other hand, we reasoned that it would convince the Russians the farm was not occupied, and we should be left in peace all day by the enemy. Later that day, we heard the Russians sawing wood in the forest directly in front of us, and also some hammering and shouting. They were obviously unaware of our presence, and were getting on with building bunkers and fortifications. Through binoculars, we could see a Russian soldier digging a slit trench right in the middle of a field. When he had finished, he carefully camouflaged it and slowly strolled back to the woods. It would have been easy to have shot him, but we did not dare give away our presence. Instead, we carefully noted the position of the trench so that our patrols could deal with the Russian listening post the following night. Once it was dark, we left the ruins and dug a well-concealed position for our machine gun in the orchard. Around midnight, our replacements arrived, and after pointing out the direction of the enemy to them, we left the ruined farm. When we reached our own lines, we reported to the company commander and went down into the cellar once more to sleep. We spent the next day resting. Someone managed to organize a little flour and a few eggs, and we made a real feast of pancakes with some jam, which we had found in the farm's larder. We slept all afternoon, but in the evening were ordered to join the neighbouring company in the trenches. Once more, the front line was being withdrawn a couple of miles, and 2 groups of legionnaires were to remain in the trenches as a rearguard. When we arrived, the company had already left. A sergeant showed us the part of the line that we were to man, and left wishing us the best of luck. It was a dark and windy autumn night. The unfamiliar surroundings and the knowledge that we were on our own in trenches normally occupied by a whole company made us nervous and suspicious of any noise. We would have liked to have sent up some flares to see what lay ahead, but did not dare in case it aroused the enemy. All we could do was walk along our sector of trenches, firing off the occasional shot to maintain the impression of a fully manned front line. Once more I had a machine gun and spent the long night lugging it from place to place, firing into the darkness, reloading the magazine and watching for any signs of Russian patrols approaching our trenches. By first light, I was frozen and shivering, and my eyes kept closing. Then I heard from no man's land a sound which had me instantly alert. There, somewhere in the bushes to our front, I could clearly distinguish a Russian voice calling out instructions in an agitated manner. The next moment, a salvo of shells landed somewhere behind us, and the Russians started shouting again. Another salvo of shells exploded moments later, and now it became clear that the Russian was correcting the enemy's artillery. It also seemed likely that the Russians were preparing to attack, but because of the bushes to our immediate front, we could not actually see the approach of the enemy. I could still hear the Russian's voice and tried unsuccessfully to silence him by firing into the bushes. Very soon shells were exploding right on top of us, with anti-tank guns and mortars joining in. With the bombardment really heavy now, all we could do was cower in the trenches, waiting for it to end, and the infantry assault to begin. After bringing up extra ammunition and preparing hand grenades, we were ready. The concentrated shell and mortar fire lasted about 15 minutes before ending abruptly. At the same moment, we could see enemy infantry emerging from the bushes and running towards us. Everything now depended on us. The moment of truth had arrived. Luckily, the Russian artillery and mortar fire had lifted to our rear, so they did not hit their own men. And to prevent our reserves from reaching the threatened front line, we were still under fire from Russian machine guns but had to ignore them. When we saw the enemy, they were about 300 yards away, and at that moment we started firing. The first burst from my machine gun fell short. I could see the grass and earth spurting up in front of the Russians. A quick adjustment of my aim brought results, and with my next burst several Ivans fell, as if hit by an invisible hand. 3 of them remained motionless on the ground, while a 4th one tried to crawl into the cover of some bushes, but did not get far before collapsing. Although suffering heavy losses, the Russians kept coming forward, but when the scattered groups of enemy soldiers were only about 80 yards from us, they came upon an invisible obstacle which stopped them in their tracks. There, in front of our trenches, sappers had cut down some young trees, leaving the short stumps hidden in the grass, and had attached lengths of barbed wire to them. As the Russians advanced across the belt of barbed wire, we were able to pick them off with ease. By now they were also within range of our hand grenades, and very soon those Ivans who were still alive started to run back in panic. Very few of them reached the cover of the bushes, and many dead and wounded littered the ground in front of our trenches. We were excited and jubilant, shouting to each other and continuing to fire into the bushes. Any enemy wounded who were still moving in no man's land were shot dead. The company commander walked along the trench distributing cigarettes and congratulating the men. We hoped that the Russians would not attack a second time, but they thought differently. Half an hour later we once again heard their forward observation officer directing the enemy's batteries, and down came the shells a short while later. For the first quarter of an hour their fire was directed at the barbed wire, after which the shells fell once more on the front line. We crouched in the trench, waiting for the end of the bombardment and the next attack. While cowering from the shell fire, I had my right hand above my head holding on to the top of one of the trench support posts. A small splinter hit it and passed through my palm, and although I did not feel any pain, the impact was like a heavy blow, and then my hand became numb. I could not hold the machine gun any longer and handed it over to my number 2, taking his place myself. I managed to stop the flow of blood somewhat by bandaging it, and that was all I could do for the time being. When the next enemy attack came, my job was to hand full magazines to the new number 1 on the gun. The Russians must have expected to get through the barbed wire without much difficulty, but they did not even get to it. During the preliminary bombardment, one of our machine guns had taken up a new position, right in the middle of no man's land, and well in front of our trenches. Even as the enemy troops started advancing in the open, this gun began firing long bursts. The surprise was complete, and the effect devastating. After losing many men to our concentrated fire, the Red soldiers turned and ran back. This time we knew that we had won the day. During the action my hand had not bothered me much, but now it had become stiff and swollen, and the blood was soaking through the bandage. The company commander dressed it once more and sent me to the rear. I was to look after the company's supply unit and stay with it until the situation concerning the new front line became clear. I needed no encouragement to leave the front line. Being unable to defend myself, I was scared and wanted to go as soon as possible. One of my friends had already been out in no man's land and had collected a Russian machine pistol from one of the dead. Before I left, he handed me the weapon, and I immediately felt better. I put the pistol's lanyard around my neck, grabbed the handle in my left fist, and jumped out of the trench. First I had to cross an open field, and even as I was doing so, the Russians renewed their bombardment. The shells exploded all around me, so that for a moment I became confused and threw myself into a shell hole to seek shelter, but soon realized that I stood a good chance of being hit once more if I stayed there. I jumped out of the hole and ran quickly towards the trees. Once into the wood, I was comparatively safe, so rested for a while before going on. Beyond the wood, and after crossing some more fields, I reached a road where a car soon overtook me. It stopped, and a Latvian officer offered me a lift. I was driven back 5 miles and I started to look for the supply unit, eventually being told that it had left that morning. It took me the rest of the day to find divisional headquarters, and even there nobody seemed to know the location of our supply unit, probably as all withdrawing units were still on the move. I therefore spent the night at divisional headquarters, and in the morning I still could not find out where I was supposed to go. My hand was aching by now, and I needed medical attention, which I decided to look for on my own. The nearest casualty collecting station was 10 miles away, and I walked all the way. Fortunately, it was a fine autumn day. While I was resting in some woods to the side of the road, a deserter passed quite close without seeing me. I could hear him approaching, however quietly the man tried to move, and kept him in the sights of my machine pistol all the time. He must have been desperate, and would not have hesitated to shoot me, thinking I would try to stop him. I reached the casualty collecting station in the afternoon, had my bandage changed, and was then sent to the railway station, where a Red Cross train was already waiting. We reached Cesis after dark. Before being admitted to hospital, all the wounded were first sent for a shower and their clothes were deloused. I did not stay in Cesis for long. The very next day, with the Russians approaching, the hospital was evacuated. There was not enough transport for everyone, so walking wounded had to walk along the highway towards Riga. When I left the hospital, the enemy were quite near the town, and I could hear the sounds of battle quite clearly. Some soldiers were looting a shop and passing out bottles of drink, tinned food and biscuits through a broken window. German sappers were busy blowing up the larger buildings and mining the streets. The road to Riga was packed with troops, transport vehicles and wagons and civilian refugees. It was actually quicker to walk through the fields off the road. Now and then Russian aircraft flew low along the road, shooting up and bombing the traffic. There was no sign of the Luftwaffe, so the enemy had a free hand. After walking 5 miles or so, the wounded were stopped and gathered together near a village. A short while later, buses arrived and we boarded them for the drive to Riga, which we reached that night. The town was very quiet and dark, most of those out on the streets being soldiers. The civilians were all in their homes, behind blacked-out windows. Our bus stopped near the station, and while the driver went to make inquiries about our destination, I went into a house to ask for a drink, as I was thirsty. I got the drink of water all right, but the attitude of the working-class family was quite different to the usual enthusiastic welcome reserved for Latvian legionnaires. They expected the Russians to enter the town very soon, and did not wish to be branded as collaborators. When we set off again, we were driven out of the city, and finally, late that night, were housed in an empty textile mill on the outskirts of Riga, near Jugla. The looms of the factory had been removed from the long spinning and weaving halls, and in their place were beds for the wounded, who were to be examined by army doctors who decided each man's destination. The sorting of the wounded continued throughout the next day. Some men were issued with orders to travel to Germany to convalesce, while those with minor injuries were ordered to report to local hospitals, presumably for re-employment at the front line in the near future.